Ladies and gentlemen, today is June the 8th, 2025. We are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it. Another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Well, can't complain.
I could complain for you. The world. No, I'm doing all right. I was away for a wedding last week, and it was splendid. The parties involved were successfully wed, and there were no objections in the audience, so that was a big win for both of them.
I should think so.
Yeah. I got to give a little best man speech. It was a really cool theme, Lord of the Rings theme. So they had like a violinist who was playing music as people walked in, and all the canopies and stuff looked like something right out of the Shire. And some people even dressed up in costumes that were fitting for that lore and theme. It was a really good time.
The whole wedding was themed that way.
Yeah, dude.
Oh, I see.
Heckin' awesome. I would take that for my wedding. That's a good-ass theme. Some even people had some replica swords and stuff from the show, too, which I'm about that. I love me a good sword. But it was in Hawaii, so I flew out there and got to visit for a bit. Do you know anything about Hawaii history?
I do. What did you have in mind?
I don't know. I guess the stuff that I gathered from being there was Hawaii was populated initially by people of Polynesian descent, so kind of going through the islands in the Pacific from Southeast Asia, and then just populating whatever was good. And Hawaii is really heckin' good in terms of a nice climate that's very livable year-round. It doesn't have a ton of naturally occurring crops on it. I think there's the taro leaf that grows in the woods. That's one of their main things. It's kind of potato-like, like a starchy kind of vegetable. And it grows in a lot of different conditions there in the moist jungle. And I think there were a few different kingdoms within Hawaii for a while until it was unified under some dude. I don't know his name. But then eventually American colonialism knocked on the door and they eventually became a state, but I don't really know all the details leading up to that.
Yeah, that had a lot to do with fruit and sugar and a little bit of beef.
Oh, I do know something about the sugar history because I went to see the sugar plantations.
Oh, well, by all means.
Yeah, so that was one thing that we got to see the fields that used to be sugarcane. And part of the reason that the sugar industry died in Hawaii was because the cost of shipping it was very high because it's very remote. And also, to be competitive in the sugar industry, you really had to be predatory with your business practices toward your workers and pay them very little. So as Hawaiians advocated for more reasonable pay, it was very bad when the sugar industry was big there. Whenever it became more reasonable, the whole business model became entirely untenable. So the sugar plantation business on Hawaii kind of died suddenly rather than slowly. I don't remember exactly when that law was passed, like what year, but there's basically no active sugar plantations there anymore.
Huh.
Super dead business. They have some coffee plantations and stuff. Those are more economical there. There's tourism, obviously, is a huge industry. They have lots of wild chickens and stuff on the islands, which are always running around, which is amusing.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's almost chickens. It's like being in a Pokemon game. They're just wandering around. You'll see a mama chicken with a bunch of little chicks following her. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, I guess it's not worth messing with them, huh?
No. I thought they were protected, like with a special law or whatever. People are saying no. It's just one of the consequences of Hawaii having very few natural predator animals. They don't have wolves or bears or cougars or coyotes or anything like in the mainland US that would normally check the populations of stuff like that. So, yeah, they just have an overabundance of stuff like stray cats and wild chickens because of it. I think wild boar is the biggest predator-ish creature that's on the islands some places. And that's the extent of my knowledge of Hawaii.
Well, that pretty much covers it. I think in the mid-19th century is when U.S. citizens started going there and setting up plantations to grow fruit. I think the present-day Dole Corporation, one of the leading fruit producers and canners in the United States, actually got their start there.
Yeah, they're super evil. They were burning the fields of the sugarloaf pineapple that's pretty famous for being over there in Hawaii, and just planting their own pineapple stuff. One thing that I didn't expect about fruit companies is how vicious they can be. Between South America stuff and Dole in Hawaii, like, they're mean gangsters. It's like, we grow fruit in the ground. It's like, no, we'll heckin' burn your business to ash.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty labor-intensive industry, and given that labor can organize, that kind of incentivized them to be harder on them in order to save money and preclude any kind of disruptions from labor disputes. So, and the fact that they generally operate in tropical regions that have weak governments that are highly susceptible to corruption, all of that combined into a witch's brew, so to speak, of political violence. But yeah, the American citizens there that set up plantations, I think initially had decent relations with the monarchy. The monarchy kind of just allowed them to stay because they accrued some benefits from the tax revenue and whatnot. And I think it wasn't until a couple decades later that the U.S. citizens there started getting ideas, so to speak. Obviously they wanted control over Hawaii because that was, where their property was. And the monarchy gave them relatively limited rights in that regard. So they wanted to kind of take over, and they thought that the best way to do that was to get Hawaii to be part of the United States. But the U.S. government wasn't all that interested for the most part. They kind of saw it as just a foreign adventure that wasn't worth the effort. There was some interest in imperialism in the Pacific in that time in the United States, but mostly the target was islands covered in bird shit. Basically, there was a major shortage of fertilizer basically at that time, and so there was a lot of demand for nitrate. I think that's what it was anyway. And they didn't really have the process by which you could artificially manufacture it, and so largely you had to rely on natural sources at that time. I think Chile was a major source, but the price was high enough and the shortage significant enough that there was actually economic incentive to try to lay claim to a lot of these isolated islands in the Pacific that had been accruing sort of successive layers of bird shit over time that had concentrated into fairly rich reserves of nitrate. And so there was kind of a jockeying for control over those islands for a period in the mid-19th century. But Hawaii didn't really have any of those, so I don't think Washington or Europe were that interested. I think the only thing that really made Hawaii an attractive object of foreign imperialism was its location, which is just kind of smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's a highly strategic location for naval activity, but also later on for air activity. I think the British at first technically claimed the islands. I think they were called the Sandwich Islands for a while, but I don't think they ever really pursued that claim much. Again, Hawaii was very remote, and there wasn't that much interest in it. What changed is two things. One, the local Americans, specifically the plantation owners in Hawaii, got really ambitious. They got tired of waiting for Washington to do something. And so they actually formed a militia and staged a coup and seized control of the island from the monarchy. And at that point, they immediately applied for statehood in the United States, or if not statehood, then at least becoming a territory thereof. Washington was pretty skeptical about that. There was a huge debate in Washington about what to do about it. There were a lot of people who said, hey, free real estate, let's just grab it. But there were a lot of other people that had a lot of ethical qualms with the sequence of events. They didn't like the fact that people had overthrown a legitimate government, seized power, and were kind of trying to get Washington to do their dirty work for them by consolidating their rule over the island. And there was a fairly strong anti-imperialist sort of faction in American politics at that time in general. And of course, they found the whole thing very distasteful. Ultimately, the imperialists won out, although I think it was fairly narrow. I think also President McKinley kind of weighed in on that. He himself was very pro-imperialism. You know, he wanted the United States to kind of go out into the world and not miss out on the age of imperialism that was reaching its crescendo at that time. Kind of fear of missing out, you could say, on the part of Washington elites at the time. They didn't want to miss out on all the imperialism. All the best bits had already been taken in the world, save for some territories in places like China, for example. And so there was kind of an impetus to try to participate. So Hawaii was seen as an easy win for them. So ultimately, they did vote to incorporate Hawaii into the United States, but it was very contentious. It was not just a slam dunk on the part of either the imperialists in the United States or the plantation owners in Hawaii. And you might also be interested to know that in the mid-late 19th century, as the plantations were set up, there was an immense demand for labor to work on the plantations. But there wasn't nearly enough Native American labor in Hawaii to work on the plantations, especially as, diseases started ravaging the native population. So where do you get the labor? Americans traditionally had just imported African slaves, but that wasn't really an option by that point. And so what they did instead is they started importing labor from mostly East Asia. That was sort of the main viable alternative. And after the British banned slavery in the British Empire, a lot of plantation needs, at least for the most part, were met by importing labor from either East Asia or South Asia, that being basically India. So the result of that is that there was a significant importation of Japanese labor, and their descendants actually comprise a big chunk of the population in Hawaii even today. Hawaii has, if I remember correctly, the largest proportion of its population comprised of people of Asian descent of any state in the United States. And the importation of plantation labor from East Asia was a big part of that. I think they also got some from the Philippines, but I think that came a little bit later. There was a lot of Japanese.
Just in the demographics
Sorry, go
as
ahead.
you walk around. You can see it visually in the demographics of Hawaii as you walk around. The main demographics, at least, that stood out to me would be Native Hawaiian, Asian descent, and kind of European American. It's basically those are the big three.
Pretty noticeable, huh?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Especially after going from South Dakota. South Dakota is almost all European descent. And then LA is very melting pot with a very major Latino population and African American population. But there's not really as much of those latter two in Hawaii that I saw.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. That checks with the demographic data I've seen.
It's far as heck.
Oh yeah, it's quite remote. Yeah, like I said, it's pretty much right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's really not close to much of anything. Big strategic win that the U.S. got it. It's very handy. But the circumstances were a little dicey. But yeah, as far as emigration, in the mid-19th century, Japan was a big source of emigration, people leaving the country to find work. And so they ended up not only in Hawaii, but also big chunks of South America. And there's actually still a significant residual population of people of Japanese descent in places like Peru and Brazil in particular. It didn't last all that long. Japan's economy started improving pretty soon after the country opened up, and so the outmigration kind of stopped after that. But that first wave of migration was significant enough to kind of populate Hawaii. Yeah, after that, it was more Filipinos and Chinese that started filling those plantation roles.
That makes sense. It's totally valid. It just sounds so silly when you're saying that people didn't care about Hawaii because it didn't have enough bird shit. I totally get it. You need fertilizer for your soil, but it's like, sir, should we commandeer this island? No, it's not shitty enough. Wait, what do you mean? We need a shitty island. Why do we need a shitty island? For fertilizer. Okay.
Yeah, it just didn't have a lot of natural resources, other than just decent land that you could grow fruit and sugar on. Not much else to recommend it. Economically speaking, that is. Yeah, speaking of Asian migration, labor migration, you might also be interested to know, since this kind of ties in, that in the mid-19th century, before the American Civil War, there was a big debate regarding whether or not slavery could be banned. And, well, obviously there was debate about banning slavery. And one of the arguments against banning slavery is that, if we let all of these African Americans be free, then none of them will work because they're all lazy. And so then the economy of the South will collapse. Again, early mid-19th century, very racist. So not too surprising that that was the logic they used. But you might be interested to know that one of the counter arguments to that was that even if that ended up being true, then you could just import labor from East Asia. Not so much South Asia, because that was more for British territories. But East Asian labor, Chinese labor in particular, that was seen as a viable alternative to African American labor. And it's notable that the defenders of slavery in the South rejected that. They didn't like the idea of importing a bunch of people from East Asia to kind of fill that role, specifically because they thought it would undermine the viability of slavery, even though it would have been just as economically viable, if not more so, than slavery.
How would it be more viable? If you're paying them really low wages, that's more money out, right?
Well, you kind of answered your own question. They were not going to pay them good wages. Yeah, one of the criticisms of the trade in Asian labor in this time is specifically that it was very oppressive. A lot of people ended up being debt slaves because they would not come always voluntarily. A lot of the time they would get tricked into coming. They would be told they would get paid a lot and that they could leave after 6 months to a year, and then instead they would be indebted and basically forced to work for a prolonged period of time. So the conditions were very poor, the pay was very poor, and a number of people found great issue ethically with that trade. But to answer your question, that also meant that it was very cheap. This labor was basically as cheap, if not cheaper, than buying and operating slaves, so to speak.
Oh, I'm forgetting there's like an upfront cost when you acquire a slave. It's so fucked up. Treating humans as property, but yeah, there would be an upfront cost there versus, like you're saying, trickery and deception and paying them so little money that you basically get them stuck where you are. I had heard that that's how a lot of Dubai was afforded, was getting labor from India and offering them like really good pay and stuff and lavish lifestyle, and then in the documentary was saying they basically find a way to take the person's passport. So if the boss has your passport, you can't get home. And then if you make the person pay more money than you're giving them, then they're effectively stuck trying to pay off whatever the situation that they're in might be.
Yeah, migrant labor in the Middle East faces very harsh conditions for specifically that reason. They are not afforded full legal rights. Mm-hmm. Technically they are, but in practice, employers basically own them effectively. If you ever give them any grief, if you're an employee for one of these people anyway, and you ever try to fight back against some kind of abuse, they'll just kick you out of the country, no questions asked. Mm-hmm. It's no big deal to them. Or they'll just hurt you. They can do that too. They can just have you beaten or isolated or what have you, and prevent you from going home. That's also not uncommon. It's even worse for the women, because a lot of them will end up raped or sex trafficked, mm-hmm. in addition to their duties as maids, which is nominally what they've signed on for.
Mm-hmm. Very fucked up.
Yeah, pretty much. But that was the situation in the mid 19th century. There was sort of this debate about whether it was better or worse, economically and ethically, to continue relying on slavery or to import a bunch of overworked, underpaid migrant laborers from China. It's kind of an interesting hypothetical because you could ask, what if they had actually done that? What if they had banned slavery and just started importing shit tons of Chinese into the American South? It could have significantly changed the demographics of the region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the travel logistics back then are so difficult that there's basically no way to get back home. It would be really time consuming to go across the continent from the south to the west coast and then take a boat all the way across. That's a journey and a half.
Yeah, it's quite the trip, as you say. A lot of people ended up just kind of stuck where they were. On the plus side, they've added a significant amount of cultural creativity and diversity to the places they settled in.
Mm-hmm. Really good food.
Again, Peru and Brazil, excellent examples of that. You don't really think of those as places with big Asian populations, but they actually do have pretty decent-sized minorities there.
I would like to visit South America at some point. The furthest I've been is Cancun.
Cancun?
Mm-hmm. It's in Mexico. A tourist paradise.
Did I tell you the story about my ex-girlfriend going to Cancun?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, she called me. This was like 10, 15 years ago. She's not from the United States. She's from the Far East. So she called me and she said, hey, I'm going to actually go to Cancun. And I said, wow, I'm surprised you would be that brave. I would think you would go to someplace closer. She was all excited about it. She's like, yeah, it's going to be fun. I'm going to go with my cousin, blah, blah, blah. And so then, a week later, she's getting ready to leave. And then she calls me in a panic and she says, did you know Cancun is in Mexico? I was like, yeah, you didn't? And she said, no, I thought it was in Florida.
Oh, no.
So I said, yeah, it's in Mexico.
To be fair, is Mexico safer than Florida? Half joking.
Fair point. Yeah, I kind of gave her grief for it. And I was like, yeah, that's why I was impressed you would go. I wouldn't think you would go to I didn't think you would go to Mexico. I figured you would think it too dangerous, but apparently she just didn't know. So she ended up scrambling to get her passport and all her documents in order. She did actually go, although she didn't really do much while she was there. She very much wanted to just stay on the hotel grounds. She was afraid of what would happen if she were too much more adventurous than that.
When I went, the most dangerous thing going off resort was the water would give you Montezuma's revenge.
Yeah.
So I did experience Montezuma's revenge.
Oh, you did get it.
Yeah, and he was vengeful. I mean, yeah.
Pretty
basically
uncomfortable, huh?
That just means you spend about quadruple the time on the toilet.
Gotcha.
Actually, it produced so much that they ended up sending some people out to take the land for some good fertilizer.
Okay. Yeah, that's about all I had on Hawaii. I think the only other historical stuff I know just regards stuff that you already know about, like Pearl Harbor and whatnot, Hawaii becoming a state in the early mid-1950s, etc. I think Barack Obama is from Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
Originally. Tulsi Gabbard, also from Hawaii.
It's a very pleasant place. Climate's very favorable. The people are nice. It's a good vibe.
Oh, I gather as much. I think it is a bit expensive, though, is it not?
Yeah, it's fucking expensive. It's
fucking
probably
expensive.
Yeah. If you're thinking about the price of a trip, it may be, for sort of an equivalent value, might be double the cost of Cancun.
Oh, wow.
It's very high. It's kind of like LA prices, but jacked up a little bit because it's in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that's another Jones Act victim. It's a little more expensive to ship stuff to Hawaii because you have to use American shipping companies to do it.
Ooh.
Yeah.
The libertarian's bane, the Jones Act.
It really is. Cato Institute complains very frequently about it.
It's a question from chat. Does Palantir's role in new federal data sharing order mark a leap in government efficiency or a dangerous step toward mass surveillance?
I think that contract is an AI thing. They're going to try to aggregate data into like a single AI database so that they can, I don't know, do stuff of some kind more efficiently. Yeah, the criticism is that a lot of that data is going to be very sensitive. And by having AI manage it, basically, you're not really going to know what it's doing with the data. I mean, if anybody gets access to that database and the AI, then they could have it do God knows what. But I don't know. It just depends on how they manage it. I don't even know if the contract will end up going forward. I think it's still pretty early days. Yeah, I don't know enough about the technical details of artificial intelligence to know how secure the data that is used in artificial intelligence calculations is. Because I know it kind of aggregates all of it and then does a bunch of regression analysis type stuff in order to kind of generate output. So I don't know if the underlying data is kind of still there and available or if it's not. If it is, then there should be some kind of security measures, but I don't know how that would be done or if it's even possible. So that's unfortunately too technical a question for me, given my background. I imagine some of our other tech guys in chat would know better than I would, because I know we've got some guys who work in the industry who listen periodically. Did you see that AI firm collapse this past week?
No, which one?
I don't have the name on me. Let me try to look it up for you. AI firm. It was backed by Microsoft. What was the name, though? Somebody in chat probably already has it. Let's see. Owned by Builder. Is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah.
I was Googling around for it. Yeah, so the joke on Reddit is that it was just a couple hundred Indian techs in a trench coat pretending to be AI.
Oh, shit.
They didn't actually have an AI program. They were just taking prompts, sending them to India, having some techs work on it, produce output, and then return it.
That's funny.
Yeah, it was like the company was valued at around $1 billion, so it was not like a small company by that point.
Wow. Do they actually wear trench coats? So that's kind of figured. I'm seeing like Matrix level shit.
Unknown as of publishing. We don't know yet. But yeah, there was a lot of people crowing about it. There's a lot of people very critical about the AI boom and how it's kind of a speculative bubble and that a lot of AI capabilities are way, way oversold. I know some of them personally. They never miss an opportunity to bitch about it. So yeah, this kind of confirms, at least in part, a lot of those criticisms.
What if AI isn't even real anywhere and it's just secret nerds in trench coats everywhere?
Maybe it is. It's hard to tell. Give it another couple years, we'll see how many other operations are actually just Indians pretending to be AI.
Get that bread, gamers.
Let's see. I've been focusing more on Eastern Front and other stuff, including Baldur's Gate 3. I I think I messaged you that I was thinking about new builds.
Yeah. Was there anything you were leaning toward?
Yeah, a couple of things. I started a new run specifically so that I could experiment with multi-classing. So I've been doing a bunch of that the past week.
Oh, cool.
In addition to trying to keep up with the news, read up on the Eastern Front for today. Oh, and Crunchyroll. I got a 1 month subscription to Crunchyroll, and I'm trying to get my money's worth before the 1 month runs out.
Nice. What are you going to watch?
I've already watched quite a bit, actually. Was it you who recommended Dan to Dan?
No. I haven't seen it.
Okay. It must have been my sister then.
I've heard it's good,
So
but I haven't seen it.
I was surprised how much I liked it. The premise didn't really pull me, but it is actually pretty charming. It's a kind of horror / comedy. It's also a manga adaptation. I don't really know how to describe it. It's very stylish. Very good animation, good dialogue, kind of nonsensical, but in a fun way. Yeah, I think you'd like it. Definitely give it a try if you have the time and inclination. I also finished off Thunderbolt Fantasy. They had the final season come out last year, as well as the movie that's supposed to end the series.
Ooh. Cool.
Still a strong recommend for me if you ever have time for that. I don't think anybody I've recommended it to has ended up watching it. And I've recommended it to quite a few people by now. I think people just find the puppets too off-putting. They don't really like that.
The aesthetics of the show are pretty key for a lot of people. I would say myself included.
It's very well done. I wish people would give it a chance. And it's written by Jin Urobuchi, so it's got a decent story too. In fact, the story is specifically what made me like it. Yeah, I think I had some other stuff I did, but I don't know that it was as good. I actually went out of my way just to watch Jin Urobuchi stuff over the past couple weeks, just because it's been on my watch list for a long time. Revengers was good and very short, only 12 episodes. It's a nice compact story there. And then I watched Aldnoah.0, which actually was not really written by Jin Urobuchi. I wasn't paying attention to the Wikipedia article. He did like a series outline and then wrote the first 3 episodes, and then that was it. And it very much shows. Like the first half is pretty decent, and then it falls off a cliff in the second half. Very unfortunate.
Watch a lot of shonen anime. It's kind of my genre I typically watch the most of.
That's a popular one. There's a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, I like fights. Cool fights. Jujutsu Kaisen's probably my favorite of that genre that's currently running. And then there's a special place in my heart for Kaiju number 8, because it's the only show that I've seen in a long time whose main character is in his 30s, and I just feel like I can relate. He's like 33 or something, and I'm used to all the popular shows, the characters are like late teens-ish. So it's pretty funny. He's also more of a regular dude as well. Of course, as a main protagonist, you may or may not receive superpowers of some variety, but yeah, it feels like a pretty grounded start that has some humor to it and more relatability factor.
See, I feel your pain, Neuro, because I too, at this point, prefer stories with older protagonists. I'll watch a good story about teenagers in Japanese high school, but it gets a little tiresome after a while.
Yeah.
So that's another reason to watch Thunderbolt Fantasy, because that is definitely not a show that takes place in Japanese high school. Oh yeah, I tried to finish Blast Rider. That's another one that had a lot of Urobuchi involvement. But I think he only wrote the second half of the series, and I haven't gotten to that yet. And the first half definitely did kind of wear on me after a while. Yeah, I got a bunch of other stuff on my watch list, but not all of it is on Crunchyroll. So I don't know how much of it I'm actually going to get to.
I feel like Crunchyroll is good value for the cost with how much is available to watch.
I'm inclined to agree.
You have
Especially
to
if
like anime,
you-
though, because if you don't like anime, you're kind of fucked.
Oh, well,
That's what it is.
Goes without saying.
Yeah.
That's the nature of the service. I think I had a bunch of stuff from the early aughts I wanted to get to. Stuff I wanted to watch in high school and just never got around to.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway. That's not why we're here.
Oh, before we get into any Eastern Front stuff, which I fully support if you want to do that, there was the one really dumb thing that happened this week that people wanted to ask about that probably has no substance to it at all, but favored child number 1 yelled about favored child number 2 for stuff.
Yeah, I did see that. I didn't follow it very closely because, like you say, it was dumb. It didn't strike me as especially impactful. I mean, for me, it was kind of vindicating because I said months ago that Musk, while influential, is also very inexperienced at politics and navigating bureaucracy, and that as a result, he was probably going to get outmaneuvered and would eventually get pushed out. And that seems to be what happened. There's been stories about,
How was he outmaneuvered? I didn't follow.
He was pushing really hard in his role as the head of Doge to kind of not gain control of agencies, but to have de facto decision making over things like staff and cuts. Because, of course, he was trying to cut those as much as possible. The trouble is that none of that was especially coordinated with the people who were actually appointed to run those agencies, and they did not like sharing power with Musk over things like staffing and budget. So the result was a lot of tension, and eventually those people, the heads of those agencies, successfully lobbied to basically push Musk out and restrict his ability to impact their agencies. I think the most famous example was Scott Bessent, the head of the U.S. Treasury Department. There's stories of him getting into like a raging argument with Elon Musk at one point, that degenerating into like a pushing match of some kind.
What?
So relations between different parts of the Trump administration are not good in general, but in particular, there seems to be tension with those elements and Elon Musk. And that's gotten bad enough to the point where Musk is basically being forced out. He doesn't have as much power as he had at the start. He's still making cuts and whatnot. Doge still exists, but he doesn't have nearly as much discretion as he did earlier. And also, he's not polling very well. He's kind of unpopular at this point, broadly speaking. And the administration doesn't like that. A lot of people within the administration are bad-mouthing him. There have been leaks to the press to that effect, kind of insulting him and saying that he doesn't know what he's doing, etc. I think Musk himself was also bad-mouthing people in the administration. He's been very critical of trade policy in particular, I've noted. So we kind of got into a media shouting match with some of the trade guys within the Trump administration. So, he's kind of been trending towards getting outed for a while now, but at this point, it's official. He is pretty much out of the administration. And among his criticisms over the past week was the budget bill that's getting fought over in Congress. That bill actually failed, I think, 2 weeks ago. That was one of the big news items from that week. So they're kind of not quite back to the drawing board, but they are having to kind of renegotiate it. Musk himself does not think highly of the bill. He doesn't think it goes far enough in making cuts. He thinks the budget needs to be significantly cut in order to get revenue in line with expenditures. The Trump administration didn't like that, especially Donald Trump himself, because Donald Trump himself backs the bill. It has effectively his name on it. And Musk is saying that it's a bad idea, and by extension, he's kind of indirectly criticizing the president. So that in particular is what led to the blow up over the past week. They were basically exchanging insults on Twitter regarding the budget bill. And then, of course, Musk eventually went to his usual go-to when he's insulting people in the media, which is implicitly suggesting that Donald Trump is a pedophile.
A common fallback.
Yeah, he's gone back to that a couple times now. But overall, I don't think it really means anything, because I don't think Musk was all that influential to begin with. And I figured something like this would happen eventually. So whatever the Trump administration was going to do, they're still going to do, regardless of Musk's involvement. And I don't think anything Musk ever wanted to do in the administration was ever going to happen anyway, because I figured he would get outmaneuvered and eventually pushed out. So everything is pretty much on track as it was before. No significant changes to report in that regard. The only thing of note that might come out of it is Musk maybe trying to primary some Trump-supporting politicians. I don't know if he'll actually follow through on that, but Trump was apparently worried enough about it that he said that if Musk did that, then there would be consequences. There's also a bunch of threats about pulling contracts to various Musk-owned companies. Which is skeevy, by the way. The President of the United States should not be reducing himself to trying to threaten to abuse his power to punish some individual, be they a rival or not. But that's the president we have, and so that's what's been happening. And so there is some question about the legality of some of that. But we'll see what happens in future. I mean, the ball is kind of in Musk's court at this point. He hasn't been especially successful in his efforts to influence American politics at this point, either within the Trump administration or in some of the other elections he's been spending money on. So he may be close to just going back to focusing more on the tech stuff that he's more known for. I think that would suit just about everybody at this point pretty fine, but he may have other ideas.
Yeah, there's a point in a person's life that they can accept or not. And for me, it was poker. That was my wake-up call. Actually, poker and StarCraft. For me, those were two areas where my, I would say, youthful, smart kid arrogance were just thrown into the dumpster. Because I got owned in both of those games like really hard after I had been very successful in academia, and I got the highest rank in WoW Arena and stuff, so I felt like I was hot shit. And then I went to play poker and later StarCraft. It was like a total noob again, and that really kind of waked me up to the notion of you can be good at one thing, but that doesn't make you good at everything. That doesn't mean that you automatically rock at stuff that is a difficult craft. So maybe Musk is kind of being presented with that lesson, whether he would choose to accept it or not. Because he might be good at some of the stuff that he does, but if you're just trying to jump into politics, it's a very different game.
Very much so. Let's see. But yeah, that's all I had on it, really. Just more media drama.
Just seemed like a silly thing people might ask about.
Let's see, I did have some corrections, I think. Oh, we were talking about Central Asia a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned a city in Uzbekistan where the urban population actually mostly spoke Tajik as their first language instead of Uzbek. Again, despite this being Uzbekistan, where most of the population is ethnically Uzbek. I said that that was Tashkent, but that was not accurate. It was actually Samarkand. So that's my mistake.
I don't know what either of those things are, so it's kind of a wash for me, but thanks for being honest.
Well, Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan, and it's more in the middle of the country. Samarkand is further east and closer to Tajikistan, which makes sense, again, given that a lot of people there speak the Tajik language. So I just got them mixed up in my head, basically.
Gotcha.
See, I had another correction, too. I think a couple weeks ago I said haberdash. I think what I meant to say was slapdash.
Oh.
Not quite the right word there, so that's on me. I think I was describing a Persian dynasty, the Safavids. That's what it was. Yeah, they were not haberdash; they were slapdash. They did not, in fact, sell hats. Alas. Oh, and apparently I was mispronouncing a word, so thanks for the correction. It's pronounced simulacrum, not simulacrum or whatever it was I was saying. Yeah, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in foreign policy and economics. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do enjoy the feedback.
Thanks, chat.
Yeah, and a bunch of miscellaneous stuff as far as news. So we can do that, or we can just jump into East Front, and then with whatever time we have left, we can do general.
We're 45 minutes in, so not super far. So if you wanted to do the miscellaneous first and then Eastern Front, that works.
All right. Let's see. Well, I had another highlight reel for Trump. I can't quite remember how much of this we got to last time.
I think we
did. So I apologize. I think, okay, we didn't do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully this is not redundant then. So just quick review of stuff going on with Trump. There was a new development with the Harvard TIF. He banned Harvard from admitting foreign students, although a judge later stayed the order. So for now, Harvard can still continue admitting them. On deportations, there were some, I guess, refugees from Sudan who were deported back to Sudan, which you're not really supposed to do, legally speaking. You're not supposed to deport people back to countries in which they're in danger, basically. So there was a bunch of accusations thrown around about the legality of that. A judge involved in that specific case demanded to know where another plane load was located because he was concerned they were going to do it again, but the administration refused to answer and predicated their refusal to answer on the fact that the information was quote unquote classified, which raises the specter of the administration potentially refusing to adhere to court orders on the basis of classified information. So some fun developments there. The administration decided to reverse U.S. export controls that were implemented in the final months of the Biden administration. That's actually not too surprising. Those controls were kind of rushed, and they were pretty poorly received by the private sector in the United States. So they're apparently going to scrap those and just try again. I don't think they're going to refrain from implementing export controls on, chips and whatnot. They've already expanded those export controls, but this particular iteration, where they were separating countries into different categories that would have different levels of access to U.S. chips, that's not going forward. They may do something like it in future, but for now, they've just decided that this effort isn't worth it. So whether that's the administration just scrapping something Biden did for the sake of it, because Biden did it, or if they actually just don't like the way it was set up and want to do something in a different way, up in the air, not entirely clear. The Golden Dome program was announced. This is apparently a program where they're going to develop a missile defense system that's going to be designed to protect the continental United States. It's supposed to kind of draw parallels with the Israeli Iron Dome system, which is not even remotely the same. So I'm not even sure why they wanted to predicate it on that. Iron Dome is limited range. It's very specifically designed just to shoot down sort of short, maybe medium range missiles and rockets. It's not at all designed to be shooting down ballistic missiles and whatnot. So Golden Dome will. I would point out that the United States has already been working on missile defense systems in that vein for decades now. So this is not really new, but it seems to have been repackaged by the administration as some kind of new development program. Whether or not that means they actually do anything new, or if they're just saying they want to double down on investment in established programs, that hasn't been made clear to me. But it is apparently a priority they want to push. Let's see, there's new information about the supposed suspension of U.S., I should say, offensive U.S. Cyber operations targeting Russia that happened a couple months ago. We knew that it happened, and we knew that it stopped later, but we didn't know the details about it, why it had happened and whatnot. So there was a senator who looked into it, House Rep Don Bacon, apparently. And what he found is that it happened for one day, and apparently it was done as a negotiating tactic vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. So apparently Washington, specifically the Trump administration, wanted to show some degree of good faith to the Russians to try to incentivize them to come to the table and talk peace regarding the war in Ukraine. And for some reason, this was seen as a way to do it. Another development, Garcia, the guy who was sent to El Salvador by the Trump administration, has actually been brought back from El Salvador. They're trying to paint it as new charges. Basically, they say that they have filed new criminal charges against him and they want to bring him back to the U.S. so that they can try him for those charges. So whether or not that's true or that's just them trying to cover the fact that they're adhering to a court order they didn't want to adhere to, that, again, not very clear. I'm not sure what to make of that. We'll have to watch that story develop over the course of the next couple weeks. But he is technically back in the U.S. I want to point out that this is not going to be like a full picture of all the stuff the Trump administration has done over the past couple weeks or months, actually, because I don't think we've talked about it in a while. This is basically the stuff that, again, made the highlight reel that kind of stood out to me in the news and that I thought was worth reporting on. So if I missed something, I apologize. It's not on purpose. It's probably just that I didn't know it.
We do accept YouTube comments as well, so if you have a thing to fill in or another thing to ask about, you can participate there.
Yeah, I don't have it here in front of me, but there's also been stuff going on in LA. Have you been following that at all?
No, what's going on?
Okay, so what happened is on Friday, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, the agency of the U.S. government responsible for enforcing immigration laws, staged a pretty significant series of raids in Los Angeles. Let me see if I can find the specific list here. A Home Depot in Wet Lake District, an apparel store in the Fashion District, and a clothing warehouse in South Los Angeles. And apparently a couple dozen people were taken into custody as part of those raids. Also, they detained David Huerta, whom apparently is the head of a labor union, the Services Employees International Union of California. The agency hasn't revealed yet why he was detained and for how long he's going to be detained, which has a lot of the pro-labor crowd especially upset. So this is all significant because it sparked an immediate reaction in the communities impacted. Protests started not only while the raids were in progress around the areas that were raided, but also protesters congregated around the federal jailhouse that people were being taken to. And there were pretty significant protests that happened Friday and have been ongoing since then, pretty much every day, both yesterday and today, basically, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Damn.
And the Trump administration, it's not really that meaningful. I mean, this isn't really stuff ICE hasn't done before. Maybe it's more aggressive than what they've been done before traditionally, but this is still within the rubric of their mission. And it's not unusual for there to be protests about stuff like this either. So, yes, there's been some dramatic footage and whatnot of protesters clashing with police and whatnot, but otherwise, this is all just fairly normal stuff overall. However, the Trump administration has decided to escalate it and has decided to use the president's power to mobilize a state's National Guard, which they have done. They have federalized 2,000 California National Guardsmen on the pretext that they need to preserve law and order, specifically to protect the jailhouse that has been attracting the protesters. So as of right now, as far as I know, certainly as of earlier today, there were protesters clashing with police and also California National Guardsmen under the control of the federal government in Los Angeles. I would hope it doesn't escalate further, because the governor of California has already said it's unnecessary. Because even though the LAPD is not cooperating with ICE to enforce immigration law, they are protecting the jailhouse, because that actually is sort of part of their job. And that's not unusual. That's normal. So further escalation, there's no need for National Guardsmen, basically. It's redundant. But the federal government specifically is choosing to intercede here for largely what I assume are superficial, grandstanding reasons. I think partly the evidence of that is that Trump himself went onto social media before the Guardsmen had even deployed today and thanked them for ending the unrest, which doesn't really make sense to me. Makes a lot of sense if you're just grandstanding. It doesn't really matter what the Guardsmen do in that sense. It's largely just a photo op. So I think hopefully that's what it stays. I do feel sorry for the National Guardsmen, because they're basically just being mobilized for no reason. And that actually is fairly disruptive to your life if you are a guardsman. I actually have a relative who joined, not the National Guard, but the Army Reserve. And the Army has been pretty thoroughly abusing the shit out of the reserves lately for the past 5 to 10 years. You're supposed to use them more for emergencies and contingencies, but they've been deployed semi-regularly over the past 10 years for a variety of missions, to the point where it is basically your job if you are in the reserves.
What are some of the reasons, if you know?
Shortages of manpower in the regular army. I think that's the biggest issue. Also, surge capacity. If there is some incident that requires a short-term response and you can't free up regulars for it, you can bring in the reserves for that. That would be a normal use of the reserves. Those missions, however, are supposed to be relatively short-term. They have not been in practice. So effectively, the reserves are just an extension of the Army now, above and beyond what they had been before, which was more just a contingency force. That was actually a problem during the Iraq War, too. There were a lot of reservist and National Guardsmen who ended up on extended deployments. Even worse for the regulars, because a lot of them ended up getting stop-lost. They were supposed to do like maybe 1 or 2 tours and then get rotated back to the States, and instead they would be basically forced to stay for an additional tour. I've heard of guys that did maybe 3 or 4 tours in Iraq on account of that. Not a good idea, by the way. That's extremely stressful to do a lot of tours like that in a combat zone. A lot of guys suffered on account of that.
I didn't know any of this.
Sorry, what?
I didn't know any of this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the military has been having a manpower shortage problem for a couple decades now. I think it got particularly acute after the pandemic. A lot of people say, especially on the right, that the manpower shortage is due to the military getting too woke and politicized. But I think a more likely culprit is just that the traditional demographic that the military has relied upon for recruiting has found better opportunities elsewhere. Because a lot of people join the military for the opportunities. They offer not great pay, but decent pay, but a pretty good benefits package if you qualify for it by the time you leave. And that's pretty attractive to a lot of people. But after the pandemic, wages went up overall. Obviously, inflation bit into that, but there was a lot of hiring, and you could find decent opportunities elsewhere. And that kind of ate into the target demographic for the military. And I think that's kind of a bigger problem for them. And until that changes, they'll probably just have to improve benefits and raise wages in order to attract the people they need. Doesn't really help that, the United States has been involved in a lot of questionable wars over the past couple of decades that have kind of hurt the image of the military. People will fight and die to defend their country, but fighting and dying in Iraq, Afghanistan, it's not quite the same thing. And a lot of people are a little worried that they might end up being asked to do something similar.
That makes
Maybe
sense.
if the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had gone better, it wouldn't be such a problem, but they didn't. So that's kind of a problem as far as image.
Yeah, and then also seeing what happened after the Iraq War and stuff, and the power vacuum that we talked about, and how that opens up, and then it's just whenever you leave, whoever else moves in, they take control, and then they kind of set things however they want to, rather than respecting the ideals that you've so graciously taught them. Living in the American way. So, yeah, it probably feels like a hollow victory for people. I guess if you are a veteran of those wars and you have an opinion, we welcome that. I didn't serve in the military, so I can't say what that would be like. But we do appreciate people who put their lives on the line. That's big.
Well, some fun trivia for you. This is the first time since 1965 that a president has mobilized a state's National Guard without a request from that state's governor.
Huh.
Last time it happened was, I think, in the South. I don't remember which state. Maybe Alabama. Basically, they mobilized the state's National Guard to help enforce the Civil Rights Act because there was obviously a lot of resistance to that at the time. But beyond that, every other case has been at the bequest of a state's governor. They have wanted the National Guard mobilized for one reason or the other and have called upon the feds to make it happen. Or just done it themselves, which has also happened, I think. Let's see. But yeah, that's it for the Trump highlight reel. As usual, quite a bit of drama.
Mm-hmm.
I think we had, as far as miscellaneous stuff happening, we had a couple terrorist attacks in the United States. Did you see those?
No, where?
Let's see. One of them was in Boulder, Colorado. The target of the attack was the Boulder Run for Their Lives event, which was organized by the Anti-Defamation League. Apparently, it's basically just a fun run for people who want to show support for the hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. So the perpetrator targeted that. He did not use a gun or bomb. He used fire, unusually. What I read is that he used Molotov cocktails.
Molotovs here.
Yeah. I think in one of the early articles I read, there was supposedly some kind of flamethrower device mentioned, but I never heard any follow-up to that. So as far as I know, it was just Molotov cocktails. So the perp is Mohammed Sabri Soliman, and the Trump administration says he came to the U.S. on a tourist visa in 2023, overstayed, requested asylum, and was granted it by the Biden administration.
Ooh.
So there's, as you might guess, there's a lot of angsting about, immigration and the Biden administration being too liberal on immigration and whatnot. Much gnashing of teeth, as expected. He apparently brought his family with him, and his daughter. He was apparently waiting to do something like this until after his daughter graduated high school, which happened just before the attack.
Was anyone hurt?
So oh yeah, definitely. I don't know if anybody died though. I don't think I remember reading that, but there were definitely people who were injured, severe burns and whatnot. I think they were able to kind of restrain the attacker in relatively short order. There's only so much you can do with Molotov cocktails. It's not really an anti-personnel weapon.
Mm-hmm.
That's really more of an anti-vehicle weapon. But fire is painful, and so, symbolically, it's kind of got more flair to it. And if you're staging a terrorist attack like this, then, you're kind of going for attention. So, in that sense, perhaps Molotov cocktail is not the worst choice. So let's see, there was that one, and then there was another one, I think in the northeastern U.S. Let me see if I can find it here. No, not that. Yeah, it was in Washington. So yeah, there was a museum. I think it was a Holocaust Memorial Museum. Somebody in chat can correct me on that. But basically, a guy killed 2 Israeli embassy staff members outside of the museum. I believe he shot them to death. He then entered the museum and basically just waited to be arrested. So basically 2 terrorist attacks relating to the Gaza war. Both perpetrators involved were explicitly, how should I say, justifying their attacks on those grounds, protesting the Gaza war and the U.S. involvement therein.
What's the update on the hostage situation? Have they made any trades or given any people back?
No, not that I know of. I think there was a couple bodies of dead hostages that were recovered, but beyond that, no progress towards a broader peace deal that would involve the release of both the living and dead hostages.
I don't get that. Like, wouldn't it be better to like get a better negotiation point when you have more hostages and just trade them while they're alive?
Well, I mean, the Israelis still want the dead ones. I mean, they would prefer. Hamas has been keeping them alive for the most part, but there are some who have been killed. But yeah, those that have died have either died due to medical reasons or occasionally to Israeli military action. It's not entirely clear why Hamas killed the ones they did kill. But in general, yes, you're right. They are worth more alive than dead. But even dead, they do still have some value. And so they retain them for that reason.
Shit is fucked up.
Yeah. 100-year ethnic conflict over land. You're going to see some wild shit. I have to say, the quality of American terrorists really seems to be on the decline.
Isn't that a good
Weird
thing?
choice of targets. Yeah, I mean, if you want to protest the Gaza war, right, you can do that non-violently, by the way. You don't have to resort to terrorism. But if you do, like, why would you go for a charity fund run? Like, what's the point of that? I mean, the run was not even like supporting Israel. It
I
was...
thought you were going to say the run wasn't even that fun. It was like a pretty shitty run.
Well, I mean, the run was not, how should I say, partisan. It was not like explicitly pro-Israel or pro-Netanyahu or pro-war. It was just pro-hostage, right? And that's fairly apolitical. That's something like anybody and everybody should be able to get behind. So poor choice of target there, politically speaking. That doesn't make sense to me. I can kind of understand shooting the 2 embassy people, but I really wonder whether he was targeting them specifically or he just went to the museum and just killed some random people to get attention. I haven't read an update on what his motivations were, but I suspect it's the latter. I suspect I mean that he just killed some random people and they happened to be embassy workers. I could be wrong. You know, somebody in chat, please correct me if there's been more information in that regard. But just going to a Holocaust museum and killing random people, that's dumb to me. I mean, terrorism in general doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In certain contexts, it can, but these attacks in particular seem very poorly thought out. So 2 thumbs down from me. Very poor form.
Yeah, well, the thing, if we can like take a page from the leaf of Star Wars, I know it's a fictional world, but they have a very kind of dramatized, completely evil empire. And what the rebels do, who basically do terrorist attacks, where it's not a conventional military trade, they're trying to do sneak damage, is they take military plans of stuff, and then they look for vulnerabilities in the greatest points of military firepower, and they damage those. Killing random people at places, like, I guess it's not a terrorist attack if it's directly at a military target. What's the definition again? Because now I'm thinking it's maybe not terrorism what they did.
Yeah, that's quite the hornet's nest you're walking into there. Yeah, I mean, the definition of terrorism varies wildly between governments, agencies, researchers, etc. So there's not really one fixed definition. Generally, definitions center around using violence against civilians for political reasons.
Gotcha. Okay, so Luke Skywalker did not do terrorism. we're safe.
Yeah, military targets are generally justified, but there's also a question of what constitutes a military target, because that can get kind of fuzzy too. So, for example, 9/11. What if Al Qaeda had just attacked the Pentagon? Is that still terrorism? Because the Pentagon is pretty much explicitly a military target, but it's not like a military base. It doesn't have military assets like planes and guns and whatnot. It's just a headquarters.
Mm-hmm.
But historically speaking, headquarters have qualified as military targets. So, does that matter? So that's where you kind of get into the weeds. You can also look at something like the bombing of the U.S. barracks in Beirut in the early 1980s. The U.S. deployed Marines to Lebanon to help keep the peace during an outbreak of violence during the Lebanese Civil War. And Hezbollah didn't like that, so they sent some suicide bombers to blow up the barracks. They successfully did so, killed a bunch of U.S. Marines. Is that terrorism? Because, they are killing soldiers, right? Mm-hmm. But they're not killing them in battle. They're using suicide bombs. But is that a distinction that is significant?
Yeah, that would be a depends on who you ask, I think.
Very much so.
I can
Obviously,
see how there's a muddy line of the border of terrorism, but some things are very obviously cut and dry.
Yeah, if you're just blowing up a bunch, like blowing up a wedding or something, or blowing up a hospital or what have you, then yeah, that's just terrorism. That's not helping. That's not helping your cause, really. But it's not necessarily meant to. Terrorism is kind of a long con, so to speak. It's not generally meant to generate short-term results. It's meant to undermine the authority of a government. And then if you do it long enough and undermine the authority enough to a sufficient degree, eventually people turn on the government. They may not turn to you, the terrorist, or your terrorist group, but if the authority of the state you're sort of at war with, so to speak, eventually collapses, that does create room for you and your group to operate and eventually take power if you're sufficiently brutal to win the subsequent civil war. Mm-hmm. These gambles generally do not work out great. Al-Qaeda tried this in Iraq during the Iraq War, pretty much blew up in their face. Al-Qaeda largely ended up expelled from Iraq because, well, not only the nationalist insurgents turned on them, but also Islamist insurgents turned on them. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became later Islamic State, turned on Al-Qaeda because they saw Al-Qaeda as too soft. They didn't think they were going hard enough. And Al-Qaeda actually criticized Al-Qaeda in Iraq specifically for being too brutal, and that eventually led to a break. So all told, Al-Qaeda's operations in Iraq were largely a failure for those reasons. Well, let's see. Did we talk about... There's been some developments on trade. It's actually been a while since we talked about it, so we have a little bit of a backlog, but we might put that off again. But I can give you just kind of a brief sort of overview of what I would talk about if we went into it in depth. There was a negotiation in Geneva, Switzerland between the Chinese and American governments. They both wanted to de-escalate. They did so. Tariffs were reduced significantly. So U.S. tariffs on China are no longer at like 140% or whatever. They're around 30% on average now, on account of the reduction in tariffs that followed the Geneva talks.
What were they?
However, for the past couple weeks, that arrangement has been in slow motion collapse. The talks in Geneva were not just about tariffs. They also had to do with non-tariff barriers, which included things like export restrictions. And both the Chinese and American governments think that the other is violating the Geneva Agreement regarding export restrictions. The Chinese, for their part, technically it was the Chinese who moved first. They say that the U.S. violated the agreement by openly discouraging firms from buying chips from Huawei and also by imposing new export restrictions on chips. Beijing saw that as running against the spirit of the agreement, and they retaliated by ramping up rare earth export restrictions. I thought this was interesting too. So it was a couple months ago when the Chinese announced that they were going to create a licensing regime for rare earths and rare earth refined products. But at the time, I wasn't sure whether or not they would actually implement it, because they've announced new licensing regimes before and then just gave licenses to everybody who applied. So I didn't really think the announcement of a new licensing regime was that significant. I wanted to wait and see what they did with it. And so over the past couple of weeks, what I've been learning is that they actually did implement it shortly after they announced it. And they have been giving some licenses, but nowhere near enough to meet demand. And so the result is that industries that rely on imports of rare earths, which is pretty much all of them that require rare earths to any degree in their manufacturing, have really been struggling with shortages over the past couple of weeks. It's not especially acute now, because everybody's been preparing for months, actually since late 2024, for a trade war between the US and China. So people have large inventories of stuff that they need. But they're going to get squeezed pretty soon, and they're already having to restrict production and, in some cases, think about shutting down production in order to basically respond to this shortage of rare earths materials of one kind or another. So the Chinese have been restricting exports of rare earths to the United States, actually to the rest of the world, not just the United States. They say it's non-discriminatory, but I suspect the plan here is to pressure the United States directly through the rare earth export restrictions, and then also pressure the rest of the world to come to bilateral agreements with China that serve to cut off the United States from support from traditional allies. I kind of suspect that's why the Chinese have made this a global restriction rather than just one narrowly focusing on the United States. But anyway, they have done this, and the United States obviously was upset about it. So Washington has announced that they see this as being, oh, sorry, I wanted to elaborate. They started restricting rare earths a couple months ago. When the Geneva talks happened, they actually eased up on the restrictions. They started giving more licenses. But when the Chinese government said that it believed the United States was violating the spirit of the Geneva Agreement, they started ramping up the restrictions again. That is to say, significantly reducing the pace of new licenses. So restrictions were high, then low, and are now high again on account of fallout from Geneva. So the United States government is unhappy about this. They see this as in breach of the agreement. They don't think the Chinese accusations that they were breaching the agreement before were legitimate. They say export restrictions are in line with what they were already doing and were not covered by the Geneva Agreement. So the United States now is retaliating itself by implementing new export restrictions on, I think it's aircraft engines, design software, and two other things. Ethane is one of them, and don't remember what the other thing was. I'd have to look it up. Don't have it in front of me. So this is where we are right now. Tariffs are still at the reduced level agreed to at Geneva, but export restrictions have not abated and are in fact now escalating. So we'll see what comes of that. But anyway, that's the Cliff Notes version of that. There was also a court ruling in the past couple weeks that struck down the tariffs that had been implemented under the Emergency Economic Powers Act. The court found that the act did not give them the power to implement such broad tariffs. You know, they're supposed to be implemented more narrowly for specific issues that are emergency in nature, and the court did not see any emergency. So the tariffs actually were struck down, that is to say the reciprocal tariffs in particular. However, the government appealed, and the tariffs are going to be allowed to stay in place until the appeals process runs through. So a big defeat for the Trump administration, but the fact that they're going to get to keep them in the short term is advantageous for them in their ongoing trade tariff talks. And even if the courts do shut them down, you know, that'll be a big setback, but they still have other tools they can turn to. They have other bits of legislation and other powers available to the president that they could resort to in order to continue the trade war. So definitely keep your eye on that. There was a revision to automotive tariffs. This happened, I think, more than 2 weeks ago. Basically, it's a credit plan, and I'm not going to get into all the details here, but basically it's a de facto reduction in the tariff that had been announced on all automotive imports into the United States. And it's going to last for 2 years, and it's going to kind of wind down over the course of the 2 years, which is actually smarter than what they had been doing. So I suspect Scott Bessent is behind this one. But I still don't think it's all that impactful. I think the more impactful part of this new policy was the extension that was nested in the announcement to the exemptions for CUSMA compliant goods from CUSMA partner countries. So that's Canada and Mexico. So that actually is a big win for Canadian and Mexican producers of automotive goods, either cars themselves or intermediate goods that are used to make cars. And it's also a big win for the U.S. automotive industry, which has been lobbying hard to get and maintain exactly this kind of exemption. I think it's still temporary, but there wasn't any announcement as to when it might sunset. So at some point in the future, the exemption might be withdrawn. Not entirely clear. But for now, it's looking like the Trump administration is de facto allowing duty-free access to the U.S. market for Canadian and Mexican producers of automotive goods. Japanese and Korean producers, meanwhile, are kind of getting screwed, and they're very much the locus of significant attention from the Trump administration in their ongoing reciprocal tariff talks. That's a whole other front in the battle, so to speak. Some miscellaneous notes here. The Trump administration has been bullying Apple about investing in India. Trump says he doesn't want them to do that. Apple has been kind of non-committal, which is a smart move in this circumstance. The Trump administration threatened to tariff movies for some bizarre reason. I don't even know how that works, but supposedly that's in the pipeline. And there were big anti-dumping duties announced on solar panels from Southeast Asia. That's actually a pre-existing investigation that I think goes all the way back to maybe the Obama administration. But yeah, that's it for the trade update. Again, this is a very sort of succinct version of the summary.
Thank you for your
Did you see Operation... sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for your review.
Oh, no problem.
Operation what?
Operation Spiderweb in Ukraine the past week.
I saw a chat mention it, but I don't know what it is.
All right, so here's what happened. It was, I think the planning was like 1 year. It's like the operation was 1 year in the making or something like that. So what the Ukrainians did, and I think this was the SBU, their intelligence service, is they had these trucks modified to secretly carry drones, specifically on the top of the truck. And the truck drivers that were using these trucks didn't even know they'd been modified, as far as I know. So these were like Russian truck drivers in these trucks, just moving stuff around in Russia. And once everything was in place, the drones in the trucks were activated. And they attacked, I think, Air Force bases was what it was, that housed Russian bombers, specifically Tupolev 95 Bear bombers. At least those were the ones that I saw. I think there might have been some intermediate range bombers too, I'm not sure. Regardless, these are expensive strategic assets, and they actually successfully damaged, if not destroyed, something like 24 or so. And mind you, these bases are deep inside Russia. They're not close to the border with Ukraine. These are bases that should nominally be safe from attack. And they ended up getting attacked directly by Ukrainian drones. It was quite the coup. The Ukrainian government was quite proud of itself. They've been bragging about it all week.
That's interesting. Well, whenever you have a basically new type of attack that no one has ever done before, you're basically pushing the envelope for stuff that people need to be aware of that could be used against them. Modified drone trucks. Activate!
Yeah, it was pretty smart. Gotta hand it to them. I don't know how long-term the impact is going to be. I imagine the ones that were just damaged can be repaired. But if they did actually destroy some, that would be quite beneficial. The Russians aren't likely to be able to replace them easily. Mm-hmm. Don't think they have a whole lot of manufacturing capacity still for bombers. Let's see. Supposedly, the Israeli government is sending aid to a criminal group in Gaza. I don't know if you heard about this one.
Is their crime not going well? They need some help.
Well, I don't think that's the impetus. Yeah, basically the Israeli government wants to try to play different factions in Gaza off of each other. Obviously, they want to get rid of Hamas, and they've been struggling to find partners. There are people in Gaza who are getting tired of the war and whatnot and don't like Gaza, but a lot of them, other than protesting, haven't been willing to actually fight them. But there apparently is a criminal group, kind of a clan-based criminal group, apparently, from what I was reading, that has been willing to team up with Israel. And so supposedly they've been actively fighting here and there Hamas within Gaza. As you might expect, Hamas has responded by cracking down on them and has been trying to basically kill all of them. So I don't know how much longer this is going to last. But we'll see. This supposedly is a play by Israel to try to further the eradication of Hamas, which, again, I reiterate, as I have before, is not likely to happen. Insurgent groups like this, which is basically what Hamas is at this point, are very, very difficult to stamp out completely, as the Israeli government seems to want to. So I don't see that as a viable end goal. Teaming up with rivals within Gaza, that's fairly smart, but I don't see criminal groups as being very viable. They tend to be well networked, but they're not generally especially effective fighters for the most part. So we know about this because the opposition within Israel actually announced it. They found out about it and were complaining about it because they see it as evidence that the Netanyahu government is not prioritizing the hostages. The opposition in Israel is still pro-war, I remind you. They're not opposed to going after Hamas, especially after the big raid that happened in October 23. But they're fairly cynical about the prospects of, ongoing war. For them, the move is to retaliate and then negotiate for the hostages. Maximalist goals like completely destroying Hamas do not appeal to them. They don't see it as reasonable. In fact, they would argue that even if you did get rid of Hamas, they would just be replaced by something just as bad. Let's see. Then we already talked about that. Oh, I forgot about this one. Yeah, we should have talked about this before. Do you remember the PKK?
Are those the Kurds?
Yeah, the Kurds in Turkey. They're the ones fighting for Kurdish independence or at least autonomy within Turkey. So I think we had talked before that there had been peace talks between the Turkish government and the leader of the PKK, one Mr. Öcalan, who's being held in a prison off of... actually, he's being held on a prison island off the coast of Istanbul. So there have been talks there with him about potentially bringing the conflict to a close. And, people were cautiously optimistic about that, but nobody was really sure what would happen. But I think last month, the PKK actually did announce that it was going to dissolve.
Whoa.
Yeah, so that's pretty big news if it does actually happen. But even the announcement is pretty surprising. The PKK is a militant group with roots that go back almost half a century now. They've been fighting on and off since then. So one would think that they would be pretty persistent, even in the face of peace talks. But it seems that they have agreed to the maximalist demands of the Turkish government to just dissolve completely.
Damn.
Now, it could be that radical factions refuse to do so and that the conflict goes on with new actors, but certainly this is a big achievement for the Turkish government, potentially an achievement for the Kurds if the PKK was able to extract any concessions. Not entirely clear what concessions they were able to get at this point, if any. But certainly a major development and a positive one, in so much as it means there's going to be less fighting. I would point out that if the Turkish government doesn't change how it treats the Kurdish population in Turkey, this is going to be a Pyrrhic victory. The fighting will resume at some point. But for now, it's good vibes. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we've tracked the PKK for a while. I think they've just been on the radar as like one of the groups that we've said Kurds don't have their own state, so it would be cool if they got territory for themselves. And It's
Yeah.
kind of like figuring out where you can fit in the surrounding countries if you're not gonna kind of fight for your own. But up against a nation like Turkey, they have a relatively strong military as far as world nations are concerned. So being a upstart group of people in the hills, you're fighting a very uphill battle, even if you're fighting downhill.
Yeah, it's a tough opponent. But even so, insurgencies can persist. I would think that the PKK would want to stick it out. It's pretty unusual for a group like that to just kind of fold.
Mm.
So I'm very curious about what the details of the agreement are. Let's see. The U.S. is still negotiating a new nuclear deal with Iran. No developments there, really. I do have in my notes that Khomeini did come out and say that a deal was not likely, but that could just be negotiating banter, who's to say. Did you see the Afrikaner refugees arriving at the United States?
No. So from South Africa?
Yeah. This was an initiative the Trump administration announced in the early months of their administration. They said that they were going to extend offers of refugee status to Afrikaners in South Africa. And not a lot of takers overall, not a whole lot of interest, but there were some who were interested, and they actually have come to the United States now. So we actually do have Afrikaner refugees.
Yeah, it's actually a variation of Dutch that they speak.
Yeah.
You think, because I think there's also a British presence in South Africa, that they would be English, but it's a weird kind of Dutch. So listening to them speak is like they've got a very funky accent on Dutch. And it's like God knows what they're saying.
Yeah, the Dutch are quite, well, I should say the Afrikaners are quite proud of their identity. And even after the English took over, they defended it quite strongly. That's pretty much a big part of the Boer War. It was a war fought by Afrikaners in the interior of South Africa against the British. So they've always had a distinct identity from the English. Probably relatively easy to preserve that identity since not all that many English people actually ever went to South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I think at this point, 10% of the population of South Africa is white. That is to say, of European descent. And of that population, of the European descended population in South Africa, only about 10% are English in descent.
Oh, I see.
So like 90% of the white people in South Africa are Afrikaners. So
Which
given
is
that
still,
relatively few.
that's still 9% then of the total population.
So yeah.
Nowhere close to majority. But they're probably one of the
Oh,
larger minority groups then.
Oh, yeah. But my point is just that the English were always a very, very small minority. And so that made it easier for the Afrikaners to maintain their identity, even though they lived in a English country, so to speak.
That makes sense.
Very, very interesting people, very interesting history. It's just, too bad about all the things they did.
Yeah.
Not for that, it'd be pretty cool, but yeah, there's some stuff there.
Yeah, one of their modern cultural exports that's now canceled is a group called the Antwoord.
What happened to them?
They made really good music. I like their music and their music videos and stuff, and they were in the movie Chappie, but apparently they were unethical towards their children that they had together. So they got mostly canceled. And they also severely underpaid the dancers and people who would be in their music videos relative to how much money they were making. But yeah, they have some very catchy tunes, and they're Afrikaners and very proud of it. It's kind of like its own type of gangster aesthetic almost. It's pretty cool.
I think I remember them in Chappie. We watched that together with Michael back in the day, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the movies that it's a silly movie, but it does have some interesting themes of like, if there were a robot police, how could that be abused? And if robots were smart enough to do police work, what's the distance between where they are and like sort of hitting a singularity moment where they are a conscious entity with their own desires and perspectives and stuff. And I think Chappie is basically a robot that's glitched in such a way that he doesn't have as many barriers for his behavior and his imagination, and then he gets raised by these two band members. So he ends up being very kind of South African Afrikaners gangster, which is a unique way to be relative to a lot of Hollywood news media or movies.
Yeah, that is quite distinct.
The Dutch, they really had a major global presence for a while.
They did. They were the leading commercial empire in the 1600s. But then they entered precipitous decline in the seventh. Well, I shouldn't say precipitous. It was kind of a slow decline over the course of the 1700s. But yeah, at their heyday, they were definitely getting around. Their big advantage was they had very advanced capital markets. In fact, technically, the world's first stock market was founded in Amsterdam in, I want to say, like the 1500s, something around there. Actually, maybe it wouldn't be 15 or 1600s. I don't remember which. And their East India Company was the most successful of any European country. Mm-hmm. I know that the English East India Company obviously ended up building an empire, but they did that much later. They ended up becoming prominent in India, which was not really seen as a viable prize over the course of the 1600s. The 1600s was really all about spice. That was really more what European traders wanted. And so there was kind of a race to find the origin of the spice that they were buying from the Asian merchants. And that was very difficult because, of course, that was kind of a trade secret. That's not something that you just kind of advertise to people who don't know. And ultimately, the Dutch sort of won that race. They were able to figure it out and conquer the islands and monopolize the production and sale of the spices that had driven a lot of the East Indies trade with Europe. And so the English kind of accepted India as a consolation prize. And they didn't even dominate it at first. Like in the 1600s, the English were not dominant traders in India. In fact, the Europeans, if you look at a map of European empire in the 1600s, you'll often see these little sort of dots in India and other parts of the Far East. And these are often called colonies. But that's not really accurate. They weren't really colonies at that time, for the most part. There were some that did qualify, like the islands that the Dutch conquered in Indonesia. But for the most part, these were actually not colonies, but what were called factories. And factory at that time had a different meaning than what it has today. Today, it obviously means like manufacturing factory. But back in the day, it didn't have anything to do with manufacturing per se. Factory was more like a combination outpost and warehouse. You know, it was a place where you could store your goods if you were basically if you worked with the company in some way that owned the factory, or if you otherwise dealt with it. You know, the factory would sometimes be open to other merchant traders from the home country if they kind of felt like it. So the factory grounds had a warehouse. It also had a rudimentary judiciary, so that if you, as a trader from abroad, from the home country that the owner of the factory was from, if you had a dispute with somebody else from that country, or more particularly with the company, then you could refer to the dispute resolution mechanism on site at the factory. And that was preferable to a lot of traders because the judicial system in a lot of the countries they traded in was relatively rudimentary. They didn't have like constitutional orders and that kind of thing. In fact, some of them still used what did they call it? Basically, if you got in a dispute with somebody and you went to the government, then they would come up with some really arcane, abusive way to resolve it. One of the ones I read about was they would stick your hand in boiling water. And if you pulled it out, then that meant you were guilty.
What?
Yeah.
That's some hocus pocus shit.
Yeah, and some of that is a little bit bullshit because, like, I think even the government doing that kind of knew it was dumb, and basically it was just a means to get bribes. So, if you were accused of some wrongdoing and you were brought before the government, then you could bribe the guy administering the boiling water to basically make it less hot, kind of cool it off after they boil it, so you could stick your hand in and keep it there. There was a lot of corruption at the time. It was not uncommon either in Europe or the Far East. Pretty standard stuff. But because dispute resolution was questionable in those parts, mostly because of the corruption rather than the rudimentary nature of the judicial systems, merchants preferred justice systems that were modeled more on what they had back home. And they basically set that up to operate within their factories. Now, you could say that's basically a colony if, people from another country are coming and living there or doing business there and have their own courts, but not really the case, because what would happen is that the merchants, before they set up the factory, would ask for permission and would generally either buy the land or otherwise give up something in exchange for it to the government that was granting them the territory. And the territory was never granted as a concession. It was not being given up. It still technically belonged to the government in question. Like the Mughal Empire did not give up territory in Bengal to European traders. It just allowed them to set up factories on their territory. So that's not the same thing as a colony, really. It's more like Walmart setting up a warehouse overseas. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that quite qualifies as imperialism per se. Now, you could say that the way that European traders abused the corruption prevalent in those regions to their advantage was a kind of imperialism, but that's more commercial imperialism. And again, bribing public officials was not abnormal at the time. Native merchants did the same thing. Europeans just had an advantage because they had more advanced capital markets, which gave them much more access to resources than a regular, normal, local native merchant would have at their behest. And so that put them at a disadvantage in the various political battles for control over this, that, or the other politician or bureaucrat or what have you that they were trying to bribe. So the Dutch Empire in the 1600s was a commercial empire of basically warehouses overseas. Of course, they also had a military arm. All of the East India companies did. So you could say that that was more the empire. But again, they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. That would have resulted in them being cut off from trade. You can win all the naval battles you want, but if the Mughal Empire decides that nobody's allowed to trade with you, you're going to be in trouble, and your whole reason for being there is basically negated. Yeah, I think one of the exceptions to what I'm talking about was actually the Portuguese Empire, because they actually did get concessions of land. That was done as part of a treaty in order to get them to stop being shitheads. When the Portuguese arrived in the Far East, when they finally discovered a route there, around the Cape of Good Hope, they pretty quickly started engaging in wild piracy. Their ships were so much more advanced than the local ships that they were pretty regularly able to beat off, navies of the Moguls, navies of the Ottoman Empire, and also, because nobody could contest them, they could just harass merchant shipping at their leisure. They actually started giving out medallions that, of course, merchants had to pay for. And if you didn't carry one, then you were basically just free game for piracy. So they got into a negotiation with the Mughal Empire, which they'd also been raiding, raiding this, that, or the other port, in addition to shipping. And the Mughals agreed to give them some territory if they agreed to just stop doing that. And that's actually how the Portuguese got control of Goa as well as Bombay, as well as a couple of really tiny territories in northwestern India around Surat, which was a major port city at the time. And that's actually how the English ended up with Bombay. It was originally Portuguese. And again, this was not Mughal Empire that the Portuguese were allowed to operate on. This was officially ceded to the Portuguese. This was official Portuguese territory. And what happened is that a Portuguese princess was married off to an English prince. And part of the dowry that the Portuguese gave as part of that was Bombay. They just gave Bombay to the English as a kind of wedding present. And it was part of the British Empire forever after, up until India's independence. But anyway, the Portuguese, they were pretty prominent. They actually did try to set up some territorial control. But when the Dutch finally moved through in the 1600s, they steamrolled them. And the Portuguese Empire largely entered decline. The Portuguese actually dominated the coast of southwestern India, which had a bunch of trade cities that were not under the protection of the Mughal Empire. And they were just kind of too weak to fend off the Portuguese on their own. So Portuguese traders ended up basically bribing local officials and dominating merchant trade, and otherwise threatening local elites to get what they wanted. Through most of the 1500s, they were able to maintain a hegemony in that particular region, what's called the Malabar Coast. But when the Dutch moved through, they were far superior in terms of military might, as well as just in terms of commercial might. And as a result, what had been an exclusively Portuguese area ended up an exclusively Dutch area, which had largely remained up through most of the 1700s. Yeah, the Dutch were quite good at the East Indies trade, so to speak, at this time period, which is why they had so many factories everywhere. Yeah, the English were the losers of that. So it wasn't until the 1700s when things started kind of going more their way. And that had to do with free trade, actually. Because in English factories and in the few English territories in the Far East, they largely embraced free trade. And that was very contrary to what the Dutch were doing in their territories. They were very much about monopolizing production, trying to funnel all trade through Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, so that they could tax all of the ships moving through their territory and trading in their territory. And in the short term, that generated more revenue, which is what the company wanted. But in the long term, it strangled their commercial empire. For one, the spice islands that they dominated and monopolized, prices were so high that it eventually incentivized production of spice elsewhere. And that actually resulted in prices falling over time to the point where the spice trade ceased to be a viable means of deriving significant profit for the Dutch East Indies Company. So monopolizing the trade worked for a while, but pretty quickly it collapsed, specifically because they were monopolizing it. And also the fact that they tried to get all ships that traded with their territories to move through Jakarta in order to be taxed, and basically to be given licenses. That resulted in merchants preferring English territories where there were no such restrictions. So the English policy of free trade, which had been implemented to try to kind of salvage their trading empire, which again had largely been soundly beaten by the Dutch, ended up making them the dominant trading power in the region over the course of the 1700s. And that in turn is what sort of saw the collapse of the Dutch commercial empire over that same time frame. I would point out also that it wasn't as though, even though some territories had factories, I should say some European countries had factories in this, that, or the other port city, that didn't mean they dominated that port city inherently. In the Malabar coast, it kind of did. And there were parts of the Carnatic coast where it did. But in the northern reaches of India, in Surat in northwestern India, and in Bengal in northeastern India, it was very common for multiple European countries to have factories in the same port city. So again, not colonialism per se. Again, it wouldn't be that different than having just multiple competing wholesalers like Walmart and Courier and whatnot, all having warehouses in the same major port city.
We're not colonizing. We're moving Walmart and Costco over there.
Well, that's basically what the East Indies companies were. They were basically just wholesalers for the most part. Merchants historically have basically just been that, although some dabble in retail too. Historically, though, they were just more powerful because they had more money than anybody else, and so they could bribe people to do things, raise mercenary armies, etc. Obviously, that particular brand of merchant activity has been surpassed by the growth of states over the past 200-some years. So you don't really see Walmart dominating whole countries like the East Indies companies did. But again, that kind of domination didn't happen until later. That wasn't until like the 1800s, really, maybe late 1700s. Through the 1600s and the early 1700s, Indian states actually were still more powerful than the European merchants that operated in India, and they were able to constrain their power pretty readily.
Today I learned. Yeah, Go is a country that, or a city that I know about because of the psytrance genre called Goa. So they're big into techno music over there, apparently.
Yeah, that's a result of them being a major tourist destination. Lots of people from Europe actually have gone there for the better part of half a century now for vacation. And so the clubbing scene took off, and that then bred its own sort of genre of music. Well, I guess I shouldn't say genre, right? Style of music, let's say.
It is a genre or a subgenre. Goa.
I would clarify too that it's not a city.
Oh, it's not. It's a region.
Yeah, it's like a whole province. It's not a very large province, but it is much larger than like a city would be geographically. I think technically the capital is Dili. Is that what it is? Oh, Panaj. Okay, never mind. I don't know what Dili is supposed to be. Oh, that's East Timor. All right, my mistake. Yeah, there are multiple towns and cities within Goa. So not just one city per se. It's kind of like Hong Kong, actually. Hong Kong is not actually just one city.
Yeah.
Although obviously it does have one particularly large urban agglomeration that dominates the territory. But there are actually like villages and towns in other parts of Hong Kong beyond the major city that sits there. Yeah, the governance of the city in Hong Kong is kind of funky. You can't even really say there's just like one city there per se. Technically, the city is called Kowloon, but that actually refers to like one specific part of the city, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, different parts of the city actually have their own local government, so there's not really a single city authority. There's a single provincial authority for all of Hong Kong that has authority over the urban parts of Hong Kong. Kind of an unusual arrangement. Very confusing to me.
Yeah, well, the population is really high, right? So probably makes administration a little bit easier if you break it into pieces.
Well, I mean, you could say that of any large city, though. But we still have central city authorities and, everywhere pretty much. We don't generally refuse to set up a city government and just have local areas of the city kind of govern themselves under the authority of some larger national government. It would be kind of like if you got rid of the whole government of Chicago. Instead of having a city government, you would just have boroughs within the city that would be responsible for certain administrative activities. And then instead of having like a citywide police force, you would have like Illinois police that would patrol the city. And other aspects of administration would also then be managed by the state of Illinois. That's more equivalent to what happens in Hong Kong.
I see. Cool.
How are we doing on time?
1 hour 53 into it so far, so we got an hour to go ish.
Okay. That's probably enough for 1942.
Nice. I'm down for it.
Okay. So we were doing the Eastern Front. We finished last time by going through 1941. I did have some stuff I wanted to go back to 1941 for, because I did kind of look at my notes and whatnot and try to gather some things that I missed, overlooked, what have you. So I'll do that, and then I'll go to 1942, and that'll probably take up most of the remaining hour.
Nice.
So I'll start with a correction. I was mispronouncing salient, so thanks to Sea Whiskey. I've been pronouncing it salient my entire life, so it's going to take a while for me to get used to salient, but I'll try. So the next thing, I wanted to debunk something somebody in chat mentioned. Somebody said that Soviet war doctrine was actually offense-oriented. and that Germany pretty much had no choice but to prepare for war, and that the Soviets were basically planning to invade Europe. That's basically a myth. I don't think it's been like completely disproven, but the source is highly suspect, because the source of that is actually a Soviet defector that came to the United States in the 1980s. His name was Viktor Suvorov, and he wrote about it in a book that he wrote called Icebreaker: Who Started the Second World War. And that was published rather in 1988, and historians have been very critical of that book. The suspicion is that he just published it basically just to make money. Anything anti-communist invariably made money, and if it came from a Soviet defector, even more so. So people were very ready to believe the things that he asserted. But the actual evidence that the Soviet Union was planning to invade Europe, or that its doctrine, was offense-oriented, that evidence is pretty weak, as I understand it. So this is not an accurate portrayal of what the Soviets were doing. That's not to say they weren't building up their military. They were, but I haven't seen any good evidence that they were planning to invade Europe, or that Nazi Germany somehow had no choice but to invade first.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Let's see. Another correction here. I was trying to remember the famous Soviet general who was captured and ended up becoming the head of an army of Russian defectors. And I thought his name was Volkov. I was wrong. Somebody in chat pointed out his name was Vlasov. Volkov was the battle in which he was captured. It was the Volkov offensive. His army broke through German lines, but then was encircled, cut off, and then eventually destroyed. Not destroyed. I think he did end up surrendering the army, but same diff, basically. So his name was General Vlasov, and he's kind of a Benedict Arnold figure in Russian history. A couple quick notes about the pre-war period. I mentioned before that there was a pact between the Nazis and the Soviets to not attack each other, a non-aggression pact. That was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And that sort of set the stage for them to divide Eastern Europe between themselves. There actually had been a time before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed when the Soviets sought out an alliance with France and Britain. They saw that as their first choice to contain German aggression. And the British and the French were not very interested in that. They still saw the Soviet Union as a pariah state. And so they did indulge Soviet entreaties to a degree. They sent some lower-level functionaries to the Soviet Union to negotiate a potential alliance. But ultimately, the negotiations went nowhere. And the Soviets, for their part, perceived the West as not being interested. And there was a suspicion that they actually kind of low-key hoped Nazi Germany invaded the Soviets instead of the Western Europe. And that would kind of solve two problems for them. It would solve the problem of German aggression and the problem of the Soviet Union in one stroke. So, sensing that there was no alliance possible, the Soviets turned to negotiating with the Germans, and hence Molotov-Ribbentrop. So you can't entirely blame the Soviets for Molotov-Ribbentrop, although we should. That was a pretty craven move, and it obviously ended up blowing up in their face. But still, the fact that there was not cooperation between the Soviets and Western Europe, that's not entirely down to the Soviets just being paranoid. That was partly down to Western Europe not being sufficiently invested in such an alliance. Also, on another note, I'm going to focus on Eastern Europe here while we talk about the Eastern Front, but we're kind of basically talking about the Soviet war effort. And so that does kind of extend beyond Eastern Europe. So I didn't talk about it last time, but I'll talk a little bit about it this time. There was a real concern on the part of the Soviet government that they would end up at war with the Empire of Japan. And I mentioned last time that they had a large deployment of forces in the Soviet Far East, something like over 1 million men deployed in the Far East, ready for a potential Japanese invasion. And that it wasn't until the master Soviet spy, Richard Sorge, found out that the Japanese intended to attack the Western allies and not the Soviet Union, that the Soviets started redeploying those forces slowly over time to the Western Front, that being the Eastern Front of the European theater. So that's true, but there was some action before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in the Russian Far East relating to the Empire of Japan that is relevant here. And probably a lot of you already know about it, but for those of you who don't, there were actually border clashes between the Soviet army and the Japanese army in Manchuria in the late 1930s. And this was a time when Japan was not really thinking too much about invading the Soviet Union or going to war with the British and the Americans and whatnot. They were mostly focused on China by that point. However, there was an open border dispute between Manchuria and Mongolia at that time. And Mongolia was actually a Soviet puppet state at this point. So that set the stage for some border clashes while the Japanese kind of felt out how much they could get away with as far as getting their preferred border demarcation with Mongolia. The battles were relatively large for the time. I think, around 60,000 apiece. So basically one army for each side, although I think the Soviets had a bit more. There were two major border clashes in Manchuria at this time along the border with Mongolia. One of them was Kulkin Gol, and the other one was Namenhan. I don't quite remember the pronunciation. But the Japanese lost both engagements. I would point out that they didn't happen at the same time. One of them happened in I want to say like 38, and then the next one happened in 1940. Could be getting the times wrong. But the outcome of both battles was the same. The Japanese lost. I think the Soviets technically took more casualties in both battles, but it was a clear strategic victory in both for them. Strategic and tactical, I should say. So the result of that had implications for later Japanese planning, because there was a real debate within the Japanese military about a northern and southern strategy. Should we attack the British and the Americans and the Dutch in the south and get the resources we need that way, or should we attack the Soviets to the north and take their resources for our war effort? And ultimately, the Southern strategy won, but part of the reason the Southern strategy proponents won was because of how badly the Japanese army had performed fighting the Soviets in those border clashes. So while those border clashes were ultimately relatively minor in terms of their direct impact on the situation on the ground in Manchuria and Mongolia, they had a broader strategic impact in that they helped tip the scales in the debate in Japan away from invading the Soviets in conjunction with the Germans and towards invading, Malaya, the Philippines, etc. So those battles were indirectly important for the West, I should say the Eastern Front in Eastern Europe, because they did ultimately obviate the need to have large forces facing the Japanese. Also, of course, it precluded those troops having to fight the Japanese, which obviously would have been even more stressful for the Soviet war effort. Mm-hmm. Okay, so to the actual war. I don't have a map here, but one of the things I wanted to point out really quickly is the importance of rivers on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was huge, largest land battle in history. But that said, that doesn't mean that you could just kind of move around unimpeded. The major natural obstacle on the Eastern Front was invariably large rivers. And the setup of these rivers, I should say, just the location and flow of these rivers, often significantly influenced the course of military operations. Because if you have a choice of launching an offensive in a direction that avoids a major river and an alternative that requires you to cross a major river, you're going to prefer the latter, because offensive river crossing is very risky. It provides the opponent lots of opportunities to seriously fuck up your offensive. You could end up with a bunch of guys stuck on the wrong side of a river, completely cut off, or you could just get stuck with a bridgehead that's perpetually under siege that can't go anywhere. It's tricky. And obviously there's just inherent difficulties in crossing a river. If a bunch of your guys or your equipment or your supplies falls in the river while you're trying to cross it, that's going to be a problem. And of course, if you're trying to cross it while under fire, that's even more of a problem. So what you'll see is that a lot of the military operations that happen try to avoid rivers as best they can. And I wanted to especially point that out because I wanted to highlight the Battle of Smolensk as being a good case in point. When the Germans attacked Smolensk, they were kind of funneled to a degree by rivers. There was a river to the north and to the south that kind of precluded them attacking from the north or south. And as a result, they favored a more direct attack into Smolensk that funneled them into Soviet defenses that they would have otherwise been able to circumvent via penetration and mobile operations in the Soviet rear. And that's one of the reasons the Battle of Smolensk was so bloody for the Germans. Obviously, they still ended up winning, but the attrition in the battle was much higher in many of the battles that they had fought up to that point. And that's specifically because they were not able to significantly avoid Soviet defenses. They kind of had to run into the teeth of them for the first time. Let's see, I also wanted to elaborate on the siege of Sevastopol. I had said that it lasted for several months after starting in, spring, autumn 41. Not correct. It actually did last into 1942. So the siege of Sevastopol lasted roughly from mid-1941 to July of 1942. And I would point out that 90% of that time, the city was completely cut off. Let's see, and I wanted to talk a little more about the siege of Leningrad as well. There were a number of Soviet offensives to try to alleviate the siege of Leningrad. I wanted to kind of elaborate on those offensives real quick. So I said last time that the Germans were able to briefly cut off Leningrad entirely by taking a rail junction called Tikhvin to the east of Leningrad. But that over the course of the Soviet winter offensive, Tikhvin was retaken, and that the Soviets retained a narrow link to Leningrad that lasted through the rest of the war, and that significantly eased the suffering of the population. That was incorrect. Apparently, the Soviets did retake Tikhvin, and they were able to partially alleviate the siege of Leningrad by getting supplies back into Leningrad, but the Germans were eventually able to cut off Leningrad by taking Sinyavino, which are some heights to the southeast of the city. And Sinyavino subsequently became the focus of multiple Soviet offensives that were designed to retake that territory and reopen a land route to Leningrad. So still a decent amount of suffering. I think partly the suffering was alleviated after 1941 because they were able to evacuate a lot more people by that point. I think they did evacuate a lot of children in 1941 before the siege got to its worst. But I think they weren't able to really, or didn't want to anyway, evacuate a lot of civilian personnel until after 41. So I think maybe that's part of the reason why the siege wasn't as bad in 42 and 43. Still, the siege continued. The city actually was cut off completely. From the seizing of Sinyavino until 1943, I want to say. Maybe it was 44. Again, not sure on the details. But that's the gist of it. So the first attempt to take Sinyavino was September 41. That failed. And I think that's the one that ran smack into a Panzergruppen. I don't know if you remember, but last time we talked about how after the Battle of Smolensk, German forces in Army Group Center needed time to reconstitute themselves. And during the time they were waiting, the Panzer armies that were attached to Army Group Center were split up and sent either to Army Group South to help with the Battle of Kiev or sent north to end the siege of Leningrad. And the Panzer army that was sent north ended up running into, I believe, the Sinyavino offensive in September 41. And they effectively just negated each other. October 41, there was another Sinyavino offensive. This one actually ran into the Tikhvin offensive I just mentioned. And they were not able to stop the Germans from seizing Tikhvin, but they were able to stop them from advancing further. So another example of offensives accidentally timed at the same time and then negating each other. There were further Sinyavino offensives in 42, 43, but we'll just get to those later, if I can remember anyway. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify that the city actually was completely cut off and not partially cut off after December 42. December 41, like I'd said last time. Let's see, I wanted to add some details about equipment and the air war in particular. So I mentioned last time, at the start of the war, the Germans attacked Soviet air bases all along the Western Soviet frontier and basically annihilated much of the Red Air Force. So as a result, the Soviet Air Force did not have a lot of assets available to them at the beginning of the war. They did have some, but frequently their pilots were not well trained, the equipment was not well maintained, or was even just outright obsolete. And as a result, they generally got run over by German fighters, which were much more modern, the pilots better trained, better equipped, better maintained, etc. So one of the things Soviet fighters did at this time when they were at such a disadvantage is that they actually would try to ram German aircraft. You couldn't really outfly them, you couldn't outshoot them, but when all else failed, you could try to ram them. And there are actually recorded incidents of that happening where Soviet pilots would try to come up behind German aircraft, and either because they couldn't hit them with the guns or if they were just out of ammo, they would actually ram their plane into the tail of the German aircraft and either disable or down it through that fashion. Obviously, that also served to down the Soviet aircraft in doing so, but that was considered sort of a last-ditch effort. And again, number of such incidents happening. It was not all that uncommon. As far as equipment, German fighters were generally, the best German fighters anyway, were the Messerschmitt 109 and the Fokker-Wulf 190, both of which were top-notch modern fighters by the time the war started. Soviet aircraft were largely stuff from the 20s, maybe 30s, early mid-30s, generally at the earliest. They didn't have a lot of modern stuff, certainly nothing that could really compare with the most modern German aircraft. I think the main design bureaus, I should say, not companies, but they actually did have multiple design bureaus working on aircraft at the same time. The main ones for aircraft in the Soviet Union were Yakovlev and Lechushkin, I believe. I apologize if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong. Some of you might recognize Mikoyan, MiGs, and Sukhoi, the famous Su aircraft. Those design bureaus actually did exist during the war, but they didn't really produce much of note. The MiG fighters that the Mikoyan Bureau produced were pretty good at high altitude performance, but not much good for anything else. And most of the fighting in the air happened low altitude to medium altitude. So the MiG fighter that was produced was mostly relegated to high altitude reconnaissance duty. I think Sukhoi mostly produced ground attack aircraft, but I don't think anything they produced ended up getting used that much. So much more common were aircraft that were actually produced by the less well-known Soviet design bureaus of Lechushkin and Yakovlev. And Yakovlev in particular ended up producing the main Soviet fighter of the war. I don't think they had many available in 1941, but they did scale up production pretty quickly over the course of subsequent years. I think the Yak-3 in particular was the main fighter. And I think later on, the Lechushkin 7, if I'm not mistaken, late in the war, ended up becoming their best fighter. Even in these cases, Soviet aircraft were generally less advanced. German aircraft had more electronics, more, hydraulics, etc. Just more mechanically complicated to the point where it was just much easier to fly. Soviet aircraft, much less digital, fewer hydraulics, to the point where pretty much everything you needed to do with the aircraft you had to do manually. And Soviet cockpits in particular were known for being very cluttered on that count. Just a whole shit ton of levers and whatnot, whereas with German aircraft, cockpits were a lot more clean. You know, buttons, switches, various more advanced instruments, shall we say, more advanced avionics, as you would call them now.
Yeah.
So even at their best,
I got to go onto the Midway in California off the coast, and it's got a whole bunch of aircraft from different time periods, and it's really fun to get in a newer jet and then get into an older one and see like what they had to work with in terms of flying a plane. It looks very cyberpunk for the old ones. You got your shitty goggles, no fully enclosed cockpit, just a bunch of dials in front of you, and then switches that you can flip, and that's about it. Good luck.
Yeah, well, relatively rudimentary, but again, within the time period, there was a sort of range of sophistication, and the Soviets kind of struggled, and that put their pilots at a disadvantage because it actually served to make it more difficult to maneuver the aircraft in a dogfight. Mm-hmm. So you should really appreciate the Soviet aces that existed during the war, because they were playing with a severe handicap. The German aces, for their part, just ran up the score. I think in American aces in the war generally became aces with like 6 kills, 7 kills over the course of the conflict. There are recorded cases of German aces on the Eastern Front who had over 100 kills.
Whoa. And that's kills of other planes?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, that was just the disparity in the quality of the aircraft and pilots, especially early in the war. The Germans just had an immense advantage, and so the result is that they were able to win engagement after engagement. So let's see, that's planes. Tanks probably need no introduction with this crowd, but the main German tank in 41, I believe, was the Panzer III. I don't think they had the Panzer IVs yet. I'd be happy to be corrected on that matter, so, please chip in chat if I'm wrong there. The Panzer IV was like the first German tank to have a big main gun. I think it had the 75 millimeter gun. And I think it was specifically, maybe not specifically designed to counter the T-34, which also had a 75 millimeter gun, but it was designed to significantly up the ante anyway. I think it was the Panther that was actually designed in response to the T-34, technically. That was the first heavy tank that the Germans produced in that vein. And then the King Tiger came much later in like 44, late 44, 45. But yeah, earlier in the war, it was mostly Panzer IVs and Panthers. Those were sort of the main German tanks in 42, 43. The Soviets, of course, had the ever-popular T-34. Everybody loves that. Russians especially. It was actually a medium tank, not a heavy tank. So it was not necessarily designed to be the tank that spearheaded an attack. It was designed to be more maneuverable, so operational penetrations and whatnot. The Soviets did have heavy tanks. That was the KV-1 for the most part. And that was actually just a T-34 with heavy armor, which was unfortunate because the engine was not upgraded to handle the heavier armor, and that created a lot of performance problems. I think they had some other tanks that were... Sorry, go ahead.
It would get slow and hot.
Yeah. Also would break down a lot, which is a big problem. So the Soviets did have a series of older tanks, one of them in particular that looked goofy to me. I think that was the KV-2. Let me check that so I can make sure I'm not making shit up. No, not the KV-2. I don't know. It was weirdly tall, but I don't remember the designation of it. Anyway, those tanks were pretty much obsolete by the time the war started, so they didn't last very long. The Soviets also got a lot of British tanks in 40. Not a lot. They got some British tanks in 41, but they got them at a very strategic, significant time. December roughly 41, and so they were able to participate in the big counteroffensive. I think we mentioned it last time. I think much more significant were the Sherman tanks they got later in the war. I think in absolute terms, the vast majority of Soviet tanks were made in the Soviet Union. But they also had a large minority of M4 Sherman tanks available. Let's see. And I think that's about the gist of it. I'm not going to get into firearms. I don't know a lot of details about them. I think the most interesting firearm tidbit I had was the Leningrad firearm I mentioned last time. Okay, so that's it for equipment then. Oh, occupation, right? So the Germans moved in, occupied broad swaths of the Western Soviet Union. So I wanted to just briefly kind of go over some of what that looked like in the early going. The Germans hated communists. I should say the Nazi German government hated communists. So one of the first things they would do is round up all of the communists in any kind of conquered Soviet territory and just kill them, pretty much. There were some people in some territories that rose up in support of the Germans and helped them hunt down communists. These were generally nationalists of one kind or another. They were notable in the Baltic countries, because keep in mind, those had only just recently been conquered by the Soviets. They'd only conquered them in 1940, I believe. And so the next year, when the Germans invaded, the Baltic peoples were not too unhappy to see the Germans, necessarily. So all of the people that the Soviets had killed while they were occupying the Baltics, the intelligentsia, officers, the wealthy elite, etc., to those casualties, you could now add communists and Jews as the Germans ran through the territory. So lots of violence in the Baltics and other occupied territories in this time as a result. Ukrainian nationalists also rose up. This is the famous Bandera, who led Ukrainian nationalists in this time. They wanted liberation from Soviet rule. They allied with the Germans to do so, and there was not insignificant violence targeting communists and Jews on their part during this time period. Cossacks, to a lesser degree, a lot of them were emigres who left the Soviet Union, or more accurately, Russia, over the course of the Russian Civil War. They had no love for the Soviet Union, and so when the German war started, there were not a few of them living in exile who signed up for the war and ended up in the Russian National Army, I believe is what it was called, the pro-German defector army that I mentioned earlier. Anti-Semitism, no shock, the Germans targeted Jews systematically. In the early going, that was largely through Einsatzgruppen. These were sort of the precursors to the big death camps. These were actually mobile units. And at first, they largely just killed people with firing squads. But what they found is that they had trouble with members of their group killing themselves. Because it turns out having somebody do nothing all day but just shoot women, children, and other civilians to death is pretty bad for the psyche. So as a result, they had to shift their methods, and they started using trucks instead. What they would do is they would take people they wanted to execute, stick them in the back of a truck, and then they would seal it up, and they would connect the exhaust of the truck into the passenger compartment. And then they would just drive around until everybody had asphyxiated. So that was not uncommon on the Eastern Front in the early going of the Einsatzgruppen. Eventually, they would shift over to the concentration camp model, and the Einsatzgruppen would kind of obsolesce themselves. But in 1941, at least, this would have been something happening in occupied territories. And partisans, as you can imagine, there were Soviet nationalists of one kind or another, as well as just people who didn't want to be systematically exterminated by the Nazis, who would engage in partisan activity, attacking the Germans in conjunction with the Soviet government. So these guys would operate behind enemy lines. They would do hit-and-run attacks. They would sabotage rail lines, all the usual stuff you would expect from insurgents of one kind or another. Also assassinations, laying...
Oh no. Did the thunderstorm knock him out? Or is he going to come back? Could you hear the thunder in the background of his audio? He's in Texas and they have real thunderstorms there. I heard thunder, then silence. His PC exploded. You could hear it. I'm going to text him. I could hear thunder. Did you lose power? Question mark? Or did your computer go kablooey? Another one bites the dust. Is he in Dallas? Yes, he's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. You heard him say assassinations and then he cut out. Oh my gosh. They're going after Agent Smith. He's too calm when he talks about politics. Maybe it was an AC/DC concert. It could be. Can you hear the cat when he mews like that? When he's like yelling on the ground? Meow. Your bed is a classic blue screen. You think the thunderstorm was just a coincidence? Nope. He timed out of Discord. Let's see if he texts me back. Cat purr ASMR. He's cute. He's like, hey, give me attention. He gets 2 insulin shots a day because he has diabetes. Hey, you're back.
I'm back.
We were wondering if it was a storm because there were 2 big strikes of thunder and then you were gone.
Yeah, there is a thunderstorm out, so it probably is related. So hopefully it doesn't go out again, but we'll see.
But your computer didn't turn off?
Computer's fine. It was just the internet connection this time.
Oh, okay. Chow was guessing that you blue screened.
Nope. I've actually never blue screened with this computer.
Wow.
It's frozen before, but never blue screened.
Wow. What a beast of a rig. They're going to have to study that for science later. After we upgrade your computer, just set it aside. For some reason, this computer from 2008 was able to play Baldur's Gate 3. To completion.
Okay.
So you were saying assassinations, and then your voice comm was assassinated, and people got really suspect and worried.
Yeah, let me try to find out. I was talking about German. All right, did people in Western Soviet Union welcome the Germans as liberators? Some did. The Baltics, recently conquered territories like the Baltics, Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine. But for the most part, people did fight the Germans. People were patriotic and didn't just run away. And, the phrase that I heard with regard to why people did this is that there's nothing wrong with the Soviet Union that Nazi Germany is going to fix, which makes sense. Yes, things were bad in the Soviet Union. Lots of people were killed. The government was probably one of the more evil governments in history. However, that doesn't mean you just let some other country invade and conquer you. That's not going to help you, especially when it's Nazi Germany. So contrary to popular belief in a lot of the West, for the most part, people in the Soviet Union did answer the call and fight earnestly to defend their country. Okay, so a couple more items here. Yeah, we could skip that for now. Okay, so we can get started on 1942. And hopefully I can get this done in 20 minutes, about the time we have left.
You have 30, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, okay. Okay, early 1942. So at this point, I'm talking, let's say, January 42. There are still Soviet counteroffensives happening. The major offensives in December 41 are finished. The Germans have been pushed away from Moscow. There is a significant new Soviet salient jutting into German lines northwest of Moscow, and in turn a German salient incidentally jutting into Soviet lines that corresponds with the Soviet one. That was called the Rzhev salient, by the way. That's going to be important today. But by January, the fighting had kind of died down a bit there. Stalin decided that he wanted basically an offensive across the entire front. And that started in late December, early January. And it just went nowhere. There was no progress to be made. The Soviet armies were largely exhausted. They needed new troops, equipment, etc. The German lines had solidified after their near collapse in December 41. So the Soviet army basically just wasted a bunch of men and material throwing itself against fixed German defenses here. So as a result, the front was actually largely stagnant for the first couple months of 1941. And by the way, the Soviet general offensive lasted pretty much through that period, January, February, March. In that time, the Soviets kind of exhausted themselves a little bit while still trying to build up reserves, and the Germans, in turn, tried to reconstitute their forces in preparation for a new spring offensive that they were planning. Basically, another crack at conquering the Soviet Union. So let's see. Some of the reforms that were implemented here were important later. So this is kind of administrative stuff here, not actual fighting, but it's relevant. So let's just go over it really quickly. Stavka, which I remind everyone is Soviet High Command, they issued a series of memos that basically sought to improve the quality of Soviet officers. Like I mentioned last time, Soviet officers were very young and inexperienced in 1941 because most of the more experienced people had been killed off in the purges in the 1930s. In turn, their performance struggled. It was relatively bad. So Stavka wanted to try to give them some pointers in order to help them out. And this is stuff that was helpful for them, but also kind of underlines just how inexperienced they really were. So proper use of artillery. Before you launch an offensive, you should have a preliminary bombardment. Pretty straightforward. You should also have supporting fire during your offensive, and you should try to strike distant targets to help exploit breakthroughs. Intuitive stuff, but the fact that they have to tell them exhibits that this was not happening in 1941, at least not everywhere. So again, obvious stuff that just wasn't happening. And you can see how that would be a problem if you're not softening up defenders before you launch a big offensive. That's a major disadvantage you're putting yourself at there. As far as offensives, officers should concentrate forces when attacking to improve chances of a breakout. So instead of just having all of your guys all along the front attack everywhere all at once, focus forces in one particular area to try to maximize likelihood of a breakthrough. That also was not happening. We talked about some of the reasons for that last time. Risk-averse officers basically doing exactly what they were told to the letter instead of trying to be innovative. So if somebody tells you to attack, you just tell your unit to attack without putting too much planning into it. So Stavka is trying to kind of prod officers into doing better here. Regarding defensive measures, Stavka wanted them to defend in depth, basically have multiple layers of defense instead of having all of your units all in the same place, trying to maximize the likelihood of defending in that one location. Just assume there's going to be a breakthrough somewhere and have further defensive measures further inland so that you can be ready to respond instead of just collapsing. 1942 is the first year that Soviet production outstripped German production. There were 4,500 tanks produced this year that were ready by spring. 4,500 tanks were produced and ready by spring 42. And they were able to use those to form a couple of tank armies. I would point out again that in 1941, a lot of Soviet manufacturing capacity was effectively disabled, either because it was overrun by the Germans or because the Soviets themselves relocated the factory equipment further into the Soviet interior to ensure it didn't fall into the German hands. And the result of that is that while they did save that equipment being relocated is equipment that's not producing stuff. So Soviet production really suffered in 1941, and it wasn't until 1942 that the new I shouldn't say new, but the old factory equipment was set up and new factories were up and running again. So Soviet production struggled 41, significantly ascended in 1942, and was really good in 43, 44. Let's see. The Germans, for their part, and this is something I really wanted to highlight, the Germans took a lot of losses in 1941. Not as many as the Soviets did, but the Germans couldn't afford as much to replace their losses, because a lot of their losses were experienced dudes who had fought in previous wars, were well-trained officers, etc. The Soviets, by contrast, were much more able to replace their losses. So to give you an idea, over the course of 1941, the Germans lost 200,000 men. And as a result, by 1942, a lot of units were at half strength because they just couldn't replace them fast enough. German units at the beginning of the spring offensive in 1942, specifically the German units involved in that offensive, they got them up to 85% readiness, much better than half. But to do that, they had to cannibalize units in Army Group North and Center. So while Army Group South had strong units at near full readiness, German units in the rest of the on the rest of the front were like 40–50% readiness.
And cannibalize means consolidate, not eat the bodies of, right?
Yeah, they were taking men away from units in the north and center and assigning them to units in the south. Okay. So units in the south were stronger, but units in the north in turn were much, much weaker. And this is something that would also afflict the Soviet Union, not so much in 42, but increasingly so in 43 and 44. I would point out, not to get too ahead of myself, that by the end of World War II, both the German army and the Soviet army generally had units that were around 40 to 50% at best. Generally lower than that. So that's just how bad the manpower squeeze was for the Germans. And the Soviets, I would add. But in 1942, mostly the Germans were feeling this. Let's see, another item for 1942. I mentioned in 1941 that the Germans weren't really fully ready for war, and so they didn't actually have enough vehicles, especially trucks. And so before they invaded the Soviet Union, they actually just went around occupied Europe, gathering up all the trucks they could so that they could use them for their offensive, Operation Barbarossa. They actually did this again in 1942. However, 3/4 of those trucks would end up breaking down on their way to the front. And the issue there had to do with basically poor supply chains. The roads in the Western Soviet Union were very bad, especially during Rasputitsa, the rainy season, and the trucks just couldn't handle it. So the Germans ended up losing quite a few. And this leads into a conversation about logistics that I also wanted to get into here. Let me see if I can find the notes for it. Oh, here it is. So one of the reasons that the Germans failed fighting the Soviet Union had to do with difficult logistics. For one, they didn't have enough fuel and oil. They were already very low by the time they even invaded the Soviet Union, and that would just compound over the course of the fighting. But a bigger problem, well, an equally relevant problem, let's say, was just the length of supply lines. You know, the factories that largely supported all of the German equipment were located in Germany, and by early 42, and even more so, you know, by late 42, the front line was well beyond the borders of Germany. And so getting equipment to the front line was actually extremely difficult. Part of that had to do with rail lines. Soviet rail lines actually used a different gauge than German rail lines, meaning basically they were different width. And that meant that German trains couldn't use them. So the result is that they either had to get Soviet trains, which the Soviets generally made sure they couldn't do. You know, the Soviets had a scorched earth policy where they would generally try to destroy anything that would be useful to the Germans before retreating. The only alternative was to replace the Soviet rail line with German gauge line, which required tearing up the Soviet line and then producing German rail line and then laying it. As you can imagine, this was a laborious process that took a fair amount of time. So this delayed progress of German armies. They kind of had to wait for this process in order to ensure that they were able to get enough supplies, because without the rail lines, you just can't keep all of these armies in the Western Soviet Union fully fed, fully armed, etc. So this was a significant inhibitor here for the Germans. The lack of trucks, like I mentioned, also slowed them down. They could still move supplies, but they largely did so through horse-drawn carriage, which obviously is much slower. And then partisan activity in the rear obviously also played a role. The partisans made a regular habit of attacking German supply lines, trucks, what have you, in order to ensure that as few supplies as possible actually reached the front line. So all of these logistical difficulties, the length of the distances involved, the difficulty of operating in an environment where the roads are relatively poor, all made it very difficult to maintain mechanized forces in the field, or even just regular forces in many cases. And I would reiterate, I would point out again something I pointed out last time, which is that 1941 would be the absolute high point for the Wehrmacht. At no later point in the Eastern Front and the fighting therein would the German army have as many people as well supplied as they had in the fighting in 1941. You can already see them having to reduce the strength of units, having to cannibalize units to make some stronger in active parts of the front, struggling with fuel shortages, struggling with supply chains, etc. All of that is already happening in 42, and it just gets worse in later 42 and then in 43. And if you're wondering why that was such a problem, besides the distances involved, keep in mind the Germans had over 1 million men deployed on the Eastern Front. So all of those guys had to be fed, armed, etc., transported to and from the front. That requires an immense logistical capacity. And the infrastructure in the Western Soviet Union was not up to it. So that was of great benefit to the Soviet Union during the war, and much to the German army's detriment. Okay. All right, so that's background stuff, administrative stuff. To get into the actual war planning here, what did the Germans want to do? So they knew that the push on Moscow had failed in late 41. They had the option of trying again, and they were already very close to Moscow. The Regev salient, at the point closest to Moscow, was only like 50 to 100 kilometers or something away from Moscow. So they could have flooded the Regev salient with German troops and launched a big offensive and tried to overwhelm the Red Army. The trouble that they had is that the Red Army fully expected that. Soviet war planners fully expected that the German spring offensive in 1942 was going to be aimed at Moscow. And they were so confident of that they put most of their reserves and their best troops in and around Moscow in anticipation of this giant battle for Moscow that they thought would unfold in spring-summer 42. So that meant that taking Moscow would now be fairly difficult, even with the German advantage in terms of panzer armies and maneuverability and whatnot. A lot of the advantage of that came from having a weak, decentralized opponent that had weak points that you could penetrate, and then having a rear that you could freely operate in. That's much more difficult when you have a fixed target to focus on, and especially one that's as well fortified as Moscow was in 1942. So it's not inevitable that a German offensive there would have succeeded. Certainly the Germans were skeptical of that. So much so that they decided that it would be better to try to seize the Caucasus. And there was a lot of debate about whether that was the best idea, but Hitler himself ultimately was the deciding factor, because he recognized that the German army was struggling for lack of resources. The logistical chain needed fuel, needed food, etc. Germany didn't have enough. There was a lot of that in the Caucasus. So why not just seize what we need there, and then we can continue the war effort later as long as we need. So there was some logic in that, and eventually the debate, without getting into the details of it, settled on that as the main objective of the spring offensive. So planning started to launch an offensive in Army Group South that would push into Rostov in the area in the northwestern Caucasus, and that eventually culminate in seizing the oil fields in the southern Caucasus, around Grozny, I think, for the most part, is where they were located. Now, there was a lot of hemming and hawing here, and by that I just mean that the objective kind of changed over time, and would change much more later as Hitler interfered more and more in the operation of the German army. But what they decided at first here, in what was called Operation Blue, Case Blau, was first to push east, well to the north of the Caucasus. This was actually a part of the front adjacent to the city of Voronezh, which is sort of midway between Moscow and the Caucasus, roughly speaking. And the reason they wanted to start the offensive there is because they wanted to secure the flank of the army that would invade the Caucasus, because obviously if you're invading the Caucasus, you're pushing south. So if you're pushing south, you have to secure your western flank from a Soviet offensive that would presumably challenge you from the east. So in order to do that, the Germans wanted to first invade and conquer territory up to the Don River, which was a major river that ran northeast from roughly the area around Rostov. And the idea was if they could secure the river, that would be a natural defensive fortification against any potential Soviet offensive that would attack from the east. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of operations kind of centered around rivers and whatnot. This is a clear-cut example. Because another problem is that there was another river, I think it was called the Donets River, that was west of the Don River. And if they had just attacked directly towards the Caucasus, they would have had to have crossed it. So rather than doing that, it made more sense to attack north towards Voronezh, push to the Don River, and then attack south. And the idea there was to attack south between the Don and Donets rivers. So in this case, you don't have to cross any rivers. You can just go north of where the Donets rivers have their headwaters, and then just push south between them. And in doing so, you can secure the west flank of the force designed for the Caucasus and have that defensive line along the river. And then at the same time, you can just cascade down the flank of Soviet forces that are arrayed to the west. So this worked very well. For a long time, there was a suspicion among historians that the Soviets collapsed here, that they tried to just defend to the last man and were just rolled by the offensive to the north. But subsequent historical research has revealed that actually the Soviets did have a controlled retreat here. It was not haphazard. They actually did respond logically to the offensive, and instead of just having everybody die fighting, they strategically retreated in front of the advancing Germans. They still took pretty grievous losses, but ultimately they were able to preserve most of their forces. Now, before I get too much further into what happened in the spring offensive, I want to talk about the Battle of Kharkiv, or more accurately, one of the battles of Kharkiv. Over the course of the Soviet offensives running from January to March, there was a weird kind of salient that emerged near the city of Kharkiv. And the Soviets wanted to take advantage of that to cut off a German army and advance the front a little bit to the west. So they planned an offensive there in that salient. However, unbeknownst to them, the Germans wanted to even out the front line before their big spring offensive. And so they also planned an offensive targeting that same salient at the same time. And so the result is that there was simultaneous pinchers attacking north and south of the salient at the same time that a Soviet army inside the salient attacked south, trying to link up with the Soviet army attacking south of the salient. I know that's kind of complicated, but basically it just means that a bunch of Soviet and German armies all ran directly into each other again at the same time in simultaneous offensives. And the result is that the Soviets got mangled for the most part. Ultimately, the German objective was largely achieved. That is to say, the line was evened out and the salient removed. But that was technically the first major battle of 1942, so it's worth mentioning. Also, keep in mind, Rasputitsa, the rainy season, doesn't just happen during roughly October, September, kind of around that. Actually, I looked it up. It's October, early November. It doesn't just happen then, it also happens in the spring. So in the time when the ice and whatnot thaws, and I think it's March, April, there's another Rasputitsa. And the result of that is that the land basically becomes untraversable. If you're in a truck, then you basically just can't drive along these roads in the Western Soviet Union that just become so muddy that the trucks, tanks, what have you, just get stuck in it. So as a result, for one, the Soviet general offensives had to stop because it was pretty pointless during the Rasputitsa, but also the Germans, for their part, had to delay their spring offensive until after the Rasputitsa, which is part of the reason it didn't happen in earlier, basically. I think it started in June. They would have done it in May, but again, just they needed time for the roads to recover. So there was kind of a brief pause on the Eastern Front over the course of that particular period, March through May, let's say, where it was relatively quiet. Battle of Kharkiv notwithstanding. And then spring offensive starts, Operation Blue. Okay, so the push to the Don River, very successful. They pushed down the Don River, technically up. It would technically be down the Don River. Down the Don River south, and eventually they reach the sort of door of the Caucasus, the northern Caucasus. So at this point, the plan is to have most of the German army push south into the Caucasus and seize the oil fields. A smaller part of the army was dedicated to pushing east to the Volga River, beyond the Don River, to, again, secure the western flank of the advancing German army. And this was a secondary objective. Move east to the Volga River, secure Stalingrad, and then anchor defenses there. Meanwhile, presumably, the German armies moving south would conquer all of that nice oil-producing territory around Grozny and in other areas. So Stalingrad, in that sense, was actually not initially important. It was just kind of an afterthought. Like, yes, we need to secure our western flank. Stalingrad is on the western flank, so just take that and hold it. No big deal. That ended up being a problem, because since it was a secondary objective, I should say, they didn't actually receive any armor. That is to say, the German forces tasked with seizing Stalingrad were almost all infantry. They had no tanks. It was not a mechanized force. So their advance on Stalingrad was very slow, and that gave the Soviets a lot of time to fortify the city in preparation to prepare to defend it. Meanwhile, German forces that were tasked with pushing south into the Caucasus were given German armor. They had the Panzer divisions, Panzergruppen, if they had any left by that point. However, that wasn't very useful, because the territory in the northern Caucasus is very hilly. It's rugged. It's not good tank country. So this was actually a misapplication of resources. The tanks should have gone to Stalingrad, and then more of the infantry should have gone to the Caucasus offensive, but it didn't happen. And the result is that the Soviets were able to prepare Stalingrad for what would become one of the legendary battles of World War II. Now, at first, the Germans didn't think anything about taking Stalingrad. Again, they just assumed the city would fall eventually. However, the Germans took note of how ferociously the Soviets were defending the city, and it gave Hitler in particular ideas. Because one of the objectives at the beginning of the war was just to destroy Soviet armies. It wasn't necessarily to take land, but just to crush the Russian army's ability to resist, because they saw the superior manpower of the Soviet army as a major advantage for the Soviets. So if you could just cut through them as quickly as possible and crush them in a decisive series of battles, then they'll basically have no choice but to surrender, because they won't have anything to defend with. So when the Germans saw that the Soviets were willing to lose a lot of men fighting for Stalingrad, they saw that as an opportunity to force another of those decisive battles that they had been wanting. And so the result then is that midway through the invasion of the Caucasus, there was a change in plans. So instead of making the southern Caucasus the main objective, suddenly Stalingrad became the main objective, in order to destroy as many Soviet units as possible in order to crush the Red Army and ideally bring an end to the war. So this was bad mojo for everybody involved, because it meant that the invasion of the Caucasus was now undermanned and eventually stalled out. Meanwhile, the push on Stalingrad continued and did advance. They were able to push into the city and push the Soviet defenders to the breaking point. However, the Soviets were in fact fooling the Germans here. The Soviets wanted to draw the Germans into an urban battle, which of course was much more advantageous for the defenders than the attackers, so that they could, one, attrit the Germans, and two, hold them in place until they could build up reserves for a counteroffensive that would ideally encircle the Germans in Stalingrad and eventually destroy them. So the Soviets had this in mind from pretty early on. There is kind of a myth in the West that the Soviets wanted to defend Stalingrad at all costs because it was named after Stalin. That's not actually true. I'm sure some lower-ranking Soviet officers maybe thought it was important for that reason, but Stavka, for its part, didn't feel compelled to defend Stalingrad for that reason. They did want to draw the Germans into an urban battle, and they did want to string them along as much as possible for as long as possible. But they did have an actual war plan here. They weren't stupid. It's worth pointing out, too, that the Soviets, contrary to what the Germans thought, were not throwing everything they had into the Battle of Stalingrad. In fact, Stavka was very good about economizing the resources they sent there. Much to the chagrin of General Chuikov, the Soviet general in charge of Soviet defenses in Stalingrad, he was only given a minimal amount of reinforcements, basically the minimal amount he needed in order to continue defending the city. Most of the rest of new reinforcements were being built up as reserves around Stalingrad for Operation Saturn, the big counteroffensive that the Soviets were planning. Now, this little ruse went on for a while. The Germans thought they were winning because they were killing lots of Soviet soldiers, and the Soviets thought they were winning because they were successfully drawing the Germans further and further into Stalingrad. And, well, from the perspective of the rest of the world, it was just like this crazy, insane battle in a major city that was utterly devastating it. I won't get into too many of the details of the Battle of Stalingrad here, perhaps contrary to your expectations, because it was a very long, drawn-out battle with a lot of moving parts. I will say that one of the major battlefields in the Battle of Stalingrad was a grain elevator that the Soviets successfully fortified. And the Soviets, they were able to hold off successive German attacks for a prolonged period of time. I would also point out here that the Germans were successfully able to seize the vast majority of the city, contrary to what you might expect. Obviously the Soviets won the Battle of Stalingrad, so you might think that German advances were stalled out at some point, but not really so. They actually got really, really close to the Volga River. There were parts of Stalingrad where the Soviets only barely had a foothold on the banks of the Volga River that they were just barely holding on to. There were also factories and hills that both the Germans and the Soviets took from each other multiple times in successive battles. It was quite the brutal battle. It was very grueling. Let's put it like that. But the battle dragged on long enough for the Soviets to successfully build up the reserve for the big counteroffensive. It happened. It had two prongs, one north of Stalingrad and one south. They successfully penetrated German defenses, partly because, one, most of German units were actually fighting in the city or near it, but also because the units that were actually defending the flanks of the German Sixth Army attacking Stalingrad were actually not German. They were actually largely Romanian units and Italian units, and I think maybe a few Spanish units, the famous Blue Division from Spain. These units were less well-equipped, less well-trained, less experienced than the German units, and in turn they were appealing targets for the Soviet war planners. And as they expected, they ended up folding. So the Soviets were able to penetrate German lines. The two prongs of the offensive successfully penetrated deep enough to encircle the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Now, this was a massive disaster for the Germans, and they tried to respond with a push by a panzer division, I believe, led by a guy named General Hoth. Maybe it was Colonel Hoth. By the way, do a Google image search for General Hoth. He looks like a villain. He looks like the German general leading a panzer division. He has an eye patch and a big scar on his face. He looks very evil. He was the guy who was tasked with relieving the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, and he almost succeeded. He got very close. In fact, if the Sixth Army had done what he asked them to do, which was to launch an attack to their west to try to link up with his panzer division, they may well have been able to escape. However, Hitler had issued an order demanding that all units in Stalingrad hold fast and fight to the last man. And General Paulus, the guy in charge of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad, did not want to countermand Hitler's orders. And so as a result, he did not launch an attack to try to meet with General Hoth's forces, and he did end up being him and his force slowly ended up reduced over time, and eventually he surrendered. It was the biggest disaster for the German army in the war up to that point. Also, Hitler really hated General Paulus for this, because Paulus was actually a field marshal, technically. And Hitler had actually sent him a message when he was on the verge of defeat, saying that no field marshal has ever surrendered in the history of Germany. And that was basically a subtle hint that Paulus should kill himself rather than surrender. Well, Paulus didn't do that. He didn't feel particularly compelled to kill himself for the honor of Hitler. So he actually did surrender, both himself and his army, much to Hitler's chagrin. Now, there's more to the story here, and I'm going to try to get to it quickly because I know I'm running over time. So the Soviet counteroffensive here was not just designed to strangle the army at Stalingrad. It was also designed to take as much territory west of Stalingrad as possible to take advantage of the collapse in Germany's lines. And this they did. They pushed all the way north, I should say west, cutting off German forces in the Caucasus, or nearly cutting them off. I think the Germans actually were successfully able to evacuate most of their forces from the Caucasus. But in the meantime, there was a pitched battle over the northern Caucasus to prevent German forces already there from being cut off from reinforcement along the land route connecting the Caucasus to the rest of Europe. The Soviets were able to make good headway, but for the most part it failed. Ultimately, they were able to seal off the Caucasus, but the remaining German forces had already by that point retreated to the Kuban, which is basically the Western Caucasus, which is adjacent to the Crimea. And there the Germans fought a prolonged battle to try to retreat across the channel separating the Kerch Peninsula from Crimea. And I want to highlight that because there happened one of the big air battles of World War II. When we think of major air battles in World War II, we think of the Battle of Britain, the bombing of Japan, stuff like that. But in the Eastern Front, they had their equivalent, which was the Battle of Kuban. And this is where the bulk of Soviet air power was concentrated in this period. And in turn, the Germans had to concentrate a good chunk of their air power to countermand it. The Germans got the better of it in terms of casualties and whatnot, but there was an immense amount of pressure, and it actually did a lot of damage attritionally to the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. So this is one of those obscure battles you don't hear about, the air battle of the Kuban. Let's see. So the Kuban happened. Meanwhile, there was a massive push west at the same time to try to get to the Dnieper River. And it was at this point that General Manstein, one of the most famous generals, German generals of the war, performed what is known as Manstein's miracle. Because the German army was in full retreat. They were desperately trying to retreat to the Dnieper River and to defend behind it. But Manstein, and I would add Hitler really did not want to just retreat. He wanted everybody to just fight to the last man wherever they were, which, again, nobody wanted to do. That was dumb. So General Manstein had an idea. He could kind of acquiesce to Hitler's demand at the same time that he did what he wanted to do. He wanted to do a strategic withdrawal, draw the Soviets out, and then eventually, when they were overextended, which he fully expected they would be, launch a counteroffensive around the flanks of the intruding Soviet force and cut it off and make another pocket, another encirclement. And this is exactly what happened, because the Soviets at this point did not have strong logistics yet. They didn't have enough trucks to propel a major offensive forward for an extended period of time deep into German territory. So what happened is that, as predicted, Soviet forces ran deep into Ukraine, but then ran out of fuel. And at that point, Manstein pounced, cut them off, and stopped the Soviet counteroffensive in the south. And at that point, lines in Ukraine stabilized, roughly speaking, around a town called, I guess, a city called Kursk. And we'll talk a lot more about Kursk next time when we get into 1943. Now, there's another story here in 1942 that doesn't get told a lot. And I'm kind of speeding through this because I'm way over time now. And this is an offensive that we haven't really known a lot about until the past couple decades, since Soviet archives were opened up after the Cold War ended. And this is an operation called Operation Mars. And Operation Mars happened at the same time as Operation Saturn, the Soviet counteroffensive that destroyed the Germans at Stalingrad. Now, we always knew the Soviets launched an offensive around Moscow, attacking Germany's Army Group Center at the same time that the big Soviet offensive was happening in the south. We know that it was a disaster for the Soviets. They lost a lot of troops, and that the Germans ultimately won the battle. However, it was a strategic victory for the Soviets because it tied down an immense number of German troops in Army Group Center that might have otherwise been redeployed to help German Army troops in Army Group South while they were trying to contain the Soviet outbreak around Stalingrad. So still strategically useful. However, we did not know the significance of Operation Mars until the Soviet archives opened up and it became apparent. And I'm actually reading a book about this right now, so I don't know all of the details. But apparently, the Soviets intended Operation Mars to be equal in importance to Operation Saturn. This was not a case of launching a major offensive in the south and then using an offensive in the center to distract the Germans. Operation Mars was intended to destroy Germany's Army Group Center. It was meant to be a major blow. And it actually ended up being a major disaster because it basically destroyed much of the Soviet Army's strength in the center of the front. So it did achieve its objectives, and even if the Soviets took grievous casualties over the course of the fighting in the Rzhev salient, the Germans were not able to exploit that because they were thoroughly exhausted from that fighting, and also because the German army had suffered so many disasters in the south around Stalingrad. So gruesome fighting that was disastrous for both sides, but ultimately a strategic victory for the Soviets there in the center. And the Germans did actually retreat from the Rzhev salient as a result of that fighting. They needed to economize manpower, and manning a giant salient is not economical. So they decided to retreat from it, smooth out the lines, and use the manpower savings to try to bolster their forces in the south. So that's roughly 1942 in a nutshell, as quickly as I can. I would have loved to have talked more about Operation Mars, because there were actually 2 offensives targeting Germany's Army Group Center before that happened roughly contemporaneously with Operation Blue, the push to the Don River in the south. But those offensives also never went anywhere. But it's worth mentioning that the offensive in July, before Operation Mars, that was targeting Army Group Center, actually almost successfully broke Army Group Center. Keep in mind, as we mentioned earlier, Army Group Center and Army Group North were at roughly half strength. That is to say, German divisions there were roughly had half the manpower they were supposed to have. So they were already weakened, and then they had this big Soviet offensive in July that almost breaks their lines. It doesn't quite, but it came close. And the Germans were very frightened that they might attack again and really thoroughly break them, which is exactly what the Soviets intended to do. But as it happens, the Germans had a defensive specialist. I believe his name was General Madel. Not sure how to pronounce that, actually. Somebody in chat, please help me with that. But he was a known defensive specialist at that time. And he was able to take what few forces the Germans had in the reserve salient and successfully obliterate most of the Soviet attacking forces that were used in Operation Mars. So there's more to the story about that particular part of the front, but don't really have time. But that's the gist of it. 2 major Soviet offensives in 1942 in the south and in the center. The center one ends up failing so badly that people thought it was just a distraction. The south succeeded so wildly that it basically broke the German army and set the stage eventually for the Soviets to take permanent initiative in the war later on in 1943, although they would not be able to do so in 1942 because their forces were crushed in Manstein's Miracle east of the Dnieper River in Ukraine. So that's where we are at the end of 1942.
I am stuck on a game, so you have some bonus time.
Oh, shit. Okay, well, let me think here. I didn't talk about Ilyushin. So I mentioned design bureaus that designed aircraft on the Eastern Front. One of them was Ilyushin, and they specialized in attack planes that attack ground targets. And they actually produced one of the best Soviet aircraft of the war. It was not a fighter, again, and it was not a bomber. It was rather just a strike plane. It was called the Sturmovik, I believe. And I think the designation was IL-2. And there's actually a famous series of games made about it. That's, I think, just called IL-2 Sturmovik. It's probably one of the only computer games about the air war on the Eastern Front. And the Sturmovik was well liked. It was a tough plane. It was robust. It did its job well. Probably the most effective Soviet-designed aircraft of the war. So it's worth mentioning them alongside Yakovlev and Lichushkin, as well as Mikoyan and Sukhoi and whatnot. Oh, and also an addendum, well, not an addendum, but another bit of trivia about the air war on the Eastern Front. When the Germans first invaded, the Soviets actually did have some 4-engine long-range bombers. It was not very many, and they were absolutely obsolete. They were actually bombers made, I think, in the 1920s. And if you look them up, you can tell. They have kind of that 1920s style to them, kind of Gothic almost. They were very weird looking to me. But when the war started, the Soviets actually had the handful of bombers they had. They actually had more than a handful, but they'd maintained them so badly that only a couple were actually operational. So they took the few that were operational and had them raid Berlin. So there actually was a Soviet long-range bomber raid on Berlin in 1941, interestingly. It did not do much damage, as you might imagine, and they did take some losses. And also, I think a couple aircraft they lost just because of maintenance problems, mechanical difficulties. Some engines broke and they had to turn back, and some of them, I think, had to crash land, etc. So kind of a shit show to a degree, but symbolically important. The Soviets actually did bomb Berlin successfully at least once.
Did not know that. And we win. Nice.
Nice.
Cool. So that was 1942 this time, and last time we did 1941.
Yep.
How many years total?
43, 44, 45 to go.
Awesome. Very good work. Well, thanks, chat, for hanging out. Thanks, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions, and also me for handling one of the questions, at least. And all of
Well
our
done.
lovely chatters in the YouTube. I am down to game some more after if you are keen.
Oh, sounds like fun.
But we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.